What is up everyone, it's Saber here and welcome to another Naruto What If. If you end up liking the video, please consider subscribing. It's free and you can take it back at any time and it really helps me out, and this is my third channel, so if you want some more what ifs, go check out my other channels. And with all of the YouTube formalities out of the way, let's get into it. Alas, that horrible bit of business was done, and now they would have to live with it in the chaos following the failed assassination attempt. The people of King's Landing wanted nothing more than to bury their heads in the sand. Some the warriors, and those accustomed to battle, adjusted to the bloodshed better than most. Stannis Naruto Oberyn violence was standard fare for their lot. They took the strife in stride, dressed their wounds, and moved on. Others were not so fortunate. The more reserved drew inward, preferring the safety of locked doors rather than risk another confrontation. Some indulged in their chosen vices, be it wine, women, or one another. Still others gloried in the bloodshed, telling tales of the short-lived battle and all that had come with it. Marjorie was not one of them. Now that blood lay spilled, swords swung, and tempers cooled, she found her opinions of her new husband markedly reversed. How could she not? Throwing himself in front of the blade, taking a dagger meant for her neck. Without hesitation, it was the very definition of selflessness, and it moved something deep inside her. If the knife had been just a touch higher, it might have claimed his life or hers. That was death, a horrid end, true and final. There would have been no coming back from that. A small shudder rippled its way through her at the thought. The Rose had seen and done terrible much in her life, but in that moment she truly felt terror. She was not trained in combat. Until this day she'd not considered the necessity. Her mind had always been her weapon, her body her tool. That assassin had not cared a whit for all her plotting or scheming. Her wiles did not against him. His dagger would have surely taken her life if Naruto hadn't intervened. To think she'd nearly meant him ill. She'd feared he might turn out like his uncle, a drinker, whoremonger, and a glutton, unfit to rule like his uncle before him. Yet he'd shown her his selfless side this day, a valiant warrior. At that selflessness had never been one of Robert's strong suits. Strength certainly, but he wasn't the sort to throw himself into danger for the sake of a stranger. Not so his nephew. Yes, if not for the prince. A cry went up from the crowd, momentarily diverting her attention. Ha, that's right, bow before your prince, bow ya shits. Alright, perhaps Naruto was a bit like his uncle. Not a moment later, she heard her beloved's voice ring out from among the masses, echoing to raucous laughter. Good-natured chuckles followed the blonde's inebriated declaration, plucking a small smile from Marjorie's lips. It was just the sort of behavior one might expect from him at a feast, and for the life of her she couldn't tell if this drunkenness was an act or genuine. Perhaps that was for the best. If she could predict the prince's every move, then it would prove a dull marriage indeed. Thankfully he hadn't tried to climb any tables yet. Yes, despite his many injuries, the prince still insisted on drinking and feasting with to his heart's content, mingling with the guests. Even that much was easily made evident by the ruckus he was causing. How odd that his lord father wasn't so jubilant. For all of his flaws, Stannis was a grim man, one who seldom smiled and took little pleasure in life, even less now that he'd lost his wife. Strangely enough, Marjorie found that she pitted him. Heavy was the head that wore the crown, and Stannis seemed to have realized that truth too late. What had Renly said of him, his only friend, was duty, relentless, tireless duty. His son at least seemed to be focused on the feast. Loras, the blonde, boomed, his voice carrying like a thunderclap. Come sit, have a drink with us. Even from here she could see her brother's tan visage go pale. My lord, I really don't think that's wise. Nonsense, the prince laughed. I won't hear of it now. Drink. Marjorie observed her brother's discomfort with quiet amusement, settling against her seat as the flame-haired warrior ushered him over. She silently suspected Loras's reluctance to speak with Naruto stemmed from his impending marriage to the Princess Shireen. Now there was a match she didn't envy. The girl was far too young for the marriage to be consummated anytime soon, of course, but that wasn't the crux of the matter. Half of King's Landing had seen the prince shatter the jaw of the last man who dared speak ill of his beloved little sister. Poor Loras was probably scared out of his wits right now, judging by the fox-like grin. Naruto he knew it as well, so this was to be her fate then, too. Spend her life with this happy oaf. She supposed she could have done worse. 7 hells, she might have been married to Stannis. Just the thought of it threatened to sour her stomach altogether. If ever there had been a man who ground his teeth more, she'd yet to find him. In light of the attack, the king, against the advice of his small council, deemed it best to move the celebration outdoors and forsake ceremony altogether, all in the vain hope of pretending nothing had changed, that nothing might ever Upset their perfect little world. Those worst affected by the attempted coup didn't even want to acknowledge the sordid affair and were deep into their cups by afternoon. Several lives had been lost to their blades. This much stood true, but in the end the killers were beaten back with one of their own captured, no less. Said man was currently languishing in the black cells under Qyburn's ministrations. Rumors abounded the prince himself had already paid him a visit. It was expected he'd sing like a canary come morn. Thanks to him, the same prince who seemed very adept at playing the fool, Marjorie knew better. She'd seen the wicked gleam behind those bright blue eyes and the keen intellect they housed. A jester he might seem to some, but she knew Naruto wasn't who pretended to be. He might be gentle and kind, dashingly handsome. Oh dear, when had she begun to think that a bastard he might well be, but he wasn't shamed by it. If anything, he seemed to glory. Perhaps he's far too reckless. Reality tugged at her in the form of Daenerys Targaryen, ruthlessly reminding Marjorie that this prize stag wasn't hers alone. Damn. Bristling slightly at the barbed insinuation, the Rose of Highgarden straightened in her seat, plastered a smile to her face, and willed herself to face her sister-in-law. It took more effort than she cared to admit. 7 hells, she'd wanted to forget about her, not so the dragon at her side. That was utterly impossible. Which one is this Viserion? Daenerys preened, stroking the drake's fringe, eliciting a happy sound from the beautiful beast, the youngest. After a moment's consideration she continued, careful. He nips, he's beautiful. Her all wasn't at all feigned. May I? A subtle smile followed. You may. Viserion trilled loudly and flared his wings wide, happy for the attention given him. The female was right to respect him, fear him. Even he was fierce, he was powerful, he was. Oh yes, that was the spot. The redhead certainly did give nice scratches. Marjorie didn't chide him for the bravado. On the contrary, she'd seen the youngest dragon burn a man to death in an instant. He'd more than earned his keep. Oh, he was going to be a giant at this rate. If this one and his brothers reached the size of their ancestors, well, hey Viserion, come here. The growing green dragon perked up straight away at the sound of the prince's voice, and with a mighty flap he leaped from Daenerys's arms and took wing. A chorus of startled shrieks greeted his sudden flight, heads ducking, arms flung out to protect heads and platters alike, but the dragon had no interest in them. Instead, he soared over them all without a care and alighted effortlessly on the prince's outstretched arm. A great chunk of steak was his reward, and the little beast happily settled himself onto the table beside the blonde to content himself with his prize. I hadn't thought him to be a dragon tamer, Marjorie remarked. Viserion does seem to favor him. Yes, Daenerys noted coolly, watching the young drake coil about the prince's shoulders with a small smile. It must be the dragon in him. Marjorie felt her shoulders tense. Pardon, aren't you aware the Targaryen princess favored her with a false smile? Stannis Baratheon was the founder of House Baratheon, as well as the ancestor of King Robert Baratheon and his brothers Renly and Stannis. She paused, letting the silence give her words weight. Which makes him a descendant of our precious prince, I suppose. Oh dear, she didn't like where this was going. I wasn't aware, Marjorie retorted, waspishly mastering herself with an effort. I'm not surprised. His is a forgotten name. Stannis Baratheon, Daenerys replied, her eyes taking on a far distant look. During the War of Conquest he was a commander in the army of Aegon the Conqueror, and was the Conqueror's bastard half-brother. When Aegon invaded Westeros, he sent Stannis to seize Storm's End, the ancestral seat of the Storm Kings and capital of the Stormlands. Stannis defeated the Storm King Argilac the Arrogant and seized not only Storm's End but also his sigil and words, even his daughter Arbalia alongside his sword. Torment with that, he cemented his rule over their lands and became the first Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. It's almost ironic, really. A bastard accomplished all this on his own, and now another's done nearly the same. Marjorie shifted in her seat, stifling a scowl. Seemed someone had studied their history. Naruto, however distant or diluted it might be, did indeed share some Targaryen blood on his father's side. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Outwardly it made little difference. She was still married to the man, as was Daenerys. Inwardly, however, was this a subtle way for her to claim him, or were the mother of dragons' motives more sinister? A way to put her in her place. She might well have the wealth and power of Highgarden behind her, but Daenerys had 3 dragons. If they laid eggs, there would be still more. What good was grain and coin when you possessed mythical beasts capable of torching the entire realm into submission? The same beasts Aegon had used to conquer Westeros, and she had 3. How could she possibly compare to dragons? Perhaps sensing the ill thoughts between the 2 women, Loras offered a passable excuse and departed. Naruto finally found a chance to escape as well, feigning interest in a passing servant. Contrary to popular belief, he had no intention of getting caught between them, certainly not at their own wedding. No, best to let them cool their heads and douse their tempers with wine before he approached them. He might enjoy the company of dragons, but he was rather averse to being burned. Of course, if drink stirred other appetites he might find himself in a bit of a pickle later. But there was father beckoning to him from his seat at the table, best to keep up appearances and whatnot no matter how much he might despise them. Father Naruto approached and sketched a small bow. You're looking well. Stannis' gaze straight to the dragon perched on the boy's shoulder instead of trading barbs. His progenitor surprised him. Littlefinger is dead. Naruto stiffened. Is he now? How unfortunate. Inwardly his mind was elsewhere. Alright, who killed that bastard and how the hell can I thank them? He died of poison, Stannis informed him stonily, his blank countenance betraying not a whit of emotion. The servants found him in his chambers this morning. Once more came the unspoken question, did you have a hand in this matter? Naruto refused to give a reply. Such a pity. Instead, he feigned mild indifference in the face of his lord father's unspoken accusations. Snatching a drumstick from a passing platter by which to hide his concerns behind, Climate must have disagreed with him. Terrible things. Weddings, you never know what might happen. Speaking of which, with that he sank his teeth into his prize and tore it apart. You have that brew I made for you? I have it, yes. Stannis reluctantly relented, touching a hand to his vest belt. I suppose it has a purpose. It does. For the first time since the festivities had begun, Naruto permitted himself a small frown. Keep it handy if you find yourself short of breath. At that a tiny fracture of emotion finally broke through the king's stony facade. You think they would try to poison me here? I think the nobles are sodding idiots. His son countered, better to be safe than sorry. You aren't as resistant to such things as I am. Best to be on your guard. Even here another would have taken such a statement as a threat against their life, but both men knew otherwise. It was simply a fact. So many had tried to poison him in his youth. His stepmother, sycophants, brigands, advisors, and countless others. In the end he'd survived all their attempts and grown stronger for it. It would take an extraordinary dose to even face him, let alone put an end to his life. Not necessarily immunity, but close, very close indeed. I like it not, but I'll consider it. Stannis relented, nodding. See to it that you behave yourself, so long as you don't insist on the bloody betting. I won't. You have more pressing concerns. Naruto opened his mouth to protest at that, but the king cut him off sharply with a wave. Keep an eye out for anyone suspicious. Do so and I'll reward you handsomely. His son twitched almost imperceptibly. And there it was again. An almost boyish look ignited in the young man's eyes. Emotions chased themselves across his whiskered visage before he ruthlessly mastered them, composing his face into a blank mask. Once more the sight almost brought a smile to the elder Baratheon's face. Almost he knew if he smiled now the boy would never let him hear the end of it. Neither would Shireen, for that matter. Worse, they might expect his likeness to smile more often. He couldn't be bothered with that. Thus he too schooled his face into utter impassivity at his son's response. What kind of reward are we talking about here? One worthy of you. Stannis didn't elaborate further, knowing it would pique his son's curiosity. It did, of course. Is that so? I'll take what you said into consideration. See that you do, he grunted. Naruto sketched a bow. By your leave then. Stannis watched him skirt the throne and vanish into the crowd with a sigh. Absently his gaze lingered upon a burning torch. Fire flickered and coiled before his gaze, but if there were answers to be had there, the flames didn't provide them. Instead his thoughts turned inward. The boy was his blood. Stannis didn't deny this. Indeed, he accepted it. Those blazing blue eyes and firm sense of justice came from him, as did his skill with a sword. But his fiery hair and, well, that was all. His mother, a boy who possessed extraordinary abilities, a man who saw things, visions in his dreams and waking moments. He would not be broken. He would bow, physically perhaps, or the act of, but not his resolve. It refused to bend. Determination like that could not be cowed, couldn't be bought, and it certainly wouldn't waver in the face of a fight. Once he'd made up his mind, it was nigh but impossible to sway him. Rewards, however, were another matter. Recognition and praise worked well enough, but for someone who owned little beyond his blade and the clothes on his back, gifts were precious things indeed. Yes, what he had in mind would make a fine gift indeed. Do you seek answers from the flames, my lord? He didn't have to look to know. Melisandre had made herself known, soundless as ever by his side. He had not heard her approach. She'd become increasingly adept at this. The thought made him grind his teeth. Her presence at the feast would not pass unnoticed. Many would take issue with her, particularly those thrice-blasted sparrows in particular saw that he had half a mind to send her away now. Consequences be damned. Her visions were useful, truth be told, but she was becoming more trouble than she was worth, if not for the long night. No shaking. What do you want? The words escaped on a sigh. The red woman didn't answer him, not at first. Wise men often seek the counsel of fire, she mused, laying a hand on his shoulder. You'd do well to listen. He shook her off with a grunt. Spare me your riddles. What is it? What News do you have for me? Stannis's face tightened in a scowl, all too vividly aware of how he must look to her, grim and angry, forged from steel. That anger faded somewhat when she took his hand, guided it to her belly. A moment of confusion set in, hounded by a terrible realization what she said next would send his world spinning. Unfortunately, Naruto failed to notice the significant exchange. Indeed, he'd forsaken thought of his father altogether, and spared no glances over his shoulder. He'd long since made up his mind on the matter. If this was to be his wedding, if he was to be tied down to two women he didn't deserve, in his mind he still believed himself unworthy of anything resembling love. After everything he'd seen and done then, he had every intention of getting himself soused. Barring that unlikely event, he planned to entertain himself. At the very least, everyone else seemed to be enjoying themselves. Why shouldn't he? For a time he amused himself by observing the festivities. There was the Spider watching in solemn silence, as he often did. Here he spied Tyrion and Shay, the latter leading her lover away to a shadowy alcove. There he beheld Shireen playing happily with the other children of the court, closely shadowed by a flock of anxious guards. In the distance he caught sight of Oberyn and Illyria conversing loudly and at length with Ulrich of all people. Much to the giant's great discomfort, the prince laughed and raised his goblet in a toast as he passed them by. One needn't guess at their discussion, tempting as it might be to rescue his bodyguard from that predicament. Naruto couldn't bring himself to do it just yet. No, he'd let his old friend squirm a bit before he swooped, and if he swooped, swooping was bad after all. Such a thought almost made him smile. Ariane lounged near the gardens alone, though still radiant as the sun itself. The sight of her brought Naruto up short, for reasons he'd never admit. Clad in a plunging gown of golden yellow silk that accentuated her hips, she looked every bit the temptress he knew her to be. A stray spark of desire kindled in his chest at the sight of her, in spite of his best efforts to ignore it, and his mind briefly wandered. Had she worn this for him? Despite his earlier words, it was decidedly difficult to ignore her even from a distance such as this. Damn, but she was beautiful. As he looked on, the princess of Sunspear caught his gaze and held it, then reciprocated his attention with a smoldering smile, all her own. Supple fingers crooked towards him in a come-hither motion. It would be so easy for him, simple. Even a few quick steps would carry him to her side. From there it would be easy to leave the others behind, find a secluded place all to themselves. Then no, he couldn't. Desirable though she was, even though his body longed for her, a glimmer of determination won out with a supreme effort of will. The blonde shook his head and headed in the opposite direction. Perhaps had he seen her smile he would have thought twice about leaving the princess to her own devices, but even he wasn't fool enough to succumb to temptation at his own blasted wedding. Ironically, his next diversion came from a most unexpected source. Lady Olenna, just who I wanted to see, the vaunted Queen of Thorns, graced him with a nod as he arrived at her table. Nothing more. She needed no weapon to do battle. Her tongue was sharper than any blade. That gaze had cut down many men and women alike, belittled many an ambitious mind, and put paid to fools. Even Viserion seemed to wilt beneath her regard, though a bit of meat mollified the young dragonling. Flaring his wings, he abandoned Naruto's shoulder with a triumphant cry and took to the sky to join his siblings. The prince almost envied him such freedom. And what business could you possibly have with an old woman like me? Another might have taken offense at that. Naruto didn't bat an eyelash. No need for barbed words, he beamed, pulling up a chair. I've wanted to meet you for quite some time now. The old Tyrell. Harumph, that was a brave thing you did for my granddaughter back there. Boy, she admitted, stupid but brave. One might wonder if you have the same plan for her. Naruto arched an eyebrow as a servant laid a platter of food between them. No, Joffrey, if that's what you're implying. Finishing the last of his drumstick, he turned his head aside and spat out a bit of bone onto the nearby platter. I don't enjoy torture or pain, nor am I overly fond of cruelties. Your precious granddaughter is quite safe with me, I assure you. He made no mention of the ambition he'd glimpsed behind those big brown eyes of his pretty young wife. Even so, he'd saved her regardless. Whether that would earn him a knife in the back or poison in his cup remained to be seen, but if they intended to try the latter, they were going to be disappointed, very disappointed. Well, don't sit there scowling at me, eat. Laughing, Naruto did as he'd been asked, commanded rather, and claimed a portion of roast meat for himself. Olenna less than daintily snatched up some grapes and popped a number into her mouth. A beat of silence passed between them as they ate, young and old regarding one another in stony silence. Thus far the former found himself in extraordinarily high spirits, and not just from the feat. It was refreshing to trade barbs with someone without fear of consequences, more so someone who was so far above the ken of what he'd grown used to. Joffrey really was a cunt, wasn't he? Olenna sighed at that. Naruto found himself unable to restrain a small smile. He certainly was. Killing that vicious bastard gave me more relief than 1,000 lying whores. Ha, she laughed and waved his words away with a dismissive flick of the wrist. Yes, I'm familiar with the bloody saying. You still haven't answered my question, nor you mine. The whiskered warrior riposted, a weathered eyebrow was arched. And what question is that? The son of the stag didn't answer her, not at first. Instead he raised his glass and took a long draught from his cup, savoring every drop. When next he looked at her, those sky-blue eyes reminded her of the words that his house held so dear. Ours is the fury. There was fury there in his gaze, but it was a cold anger, bitter, deadly as black ice, tempered 7 hells. As she looked on his hand, idly traced one of the many wedding gifts he'd received, a magnificent shield carved of ironwood with a flawless silver trim. What drew her attention was the shield's crest, a white ironwood tree stationed on a black field, embellished with a black sword pointed downwards. To call it anything less than a masterwork would have been an insult. I wasn't aware the foresters were in attendance. Anyone knew that sigil. It pays to have friends in many places, both high and low. Naruto hummed, tearing off a great haunch of meat for himself. As I recall, their eldest daughter Mira is a handmaiden to your granddaughter. I'd very much like to see her again. Perhaps that opportunity will present itself before I leave King's Landing again. Those ice blue orbs became glaciers. Have you heard the tale of the White Hills of High Point? He inquired quietly. I can't say I'm terribly familiar with the lot. Olenna shrugged. Why don't you tell me? The White Hills, I didn't trust them. Best give High Point to someone else. You think them traitors? Naruto paused, favoring his cup. I know they're traitors. They simply haven't acted out of fear. And I suppose you're going to tell me they're afraid of you. The Queen of Thorns sighed. Those azure orbs gleamed brightly at her barbed reply. It's a recent tale, really. The Queen of Thorns steeped her fingers, perhaps sensing said story. They were a noble house who's lived for many years. Naruto began, his eyes taking on a faraway look. Their Lord Lud was a greedy man who sought to advance beyond his station. Not that there's anything wrong with that, mind you. Ambition is a common theme when it comes to lords and ladies of Westeros. He cast a pointed look at Olenna. One might even call it admirable, but Lud reached too far. His greed knew no bound, be it blade or battle, and in his avarice he sought to take advantage of a time of war and unrest to destroy the foresters, the ancient rivals of his house. I take it you took issue with that? I did. The prince laughed aloud, sawing himself a piece of pigeon pie. As luck would have it, the foresters were hosting me at the time. Unknowingly, of course. He favored her with a sly wink. What can I say? Their history fascinated me for thousands of years. House Forrester have been loyal bannermen to House Stark. Now that's loyalty. In the darkest reaches of the Wolfswood they harvest the rare ironwood trees. Did you know that it's said to be nearly indestructible? I wanted to leave Dragonstone for a bit, get out, stretch my legs, to see their famed craft for myself. Spent nearly a year there and almost got away with none the wiser. Oh, the tales I could tell you, Talia, and I got up to all sorts of trouble, but that's a story for another day. I'll have to tell you about it sometime. Where was I? Olenna rolled her eyes. You were trying to intimidate me, I believe, unsuccessfully. Lady Olenna, you wound me. Naruto feigned indignation, clutching at his heart. I would never spare me your platitudes, and get on with it as you wish. He relented with a small sigh, taking up a goblet of wine. To make a long story short, Lud was an imbecile and eventually did something he shouldn't have. I happened to be there and took exception to his, well, let's call it conduct. Now I won't spoil your meal by giving voice to his foul deeds, so I'll cut straight to the point. I killed him right there in the Forester's Hall. He made a swishing motion with his hand. I'd realized I couldn't stay after that, so I set out for Dragonstone before morning. A fortnight later my esteemed father finally took it upon himself to recognize me. Now here we are. If you expect me to believe you drove a sword through a lord's heart without consequence. Pitchfork. Actually, the blonde corrected her from behind. Nasty way to go. Is there a point to this ridiculous tale? The point, my dear lady, is that it's never wise to overreach oneself. Sometimes we must simply be satisfied with what we have. A pause followed the blonde as if to let the words sink in. Once could accuse Mace Tyrell of the same, though it all worked out in the end. Your granddaughter still married royalty in the end. I dare say she got a better deal out of it, all things considered. Olenna's laughter surprised him. It burst out of her in sharp, short bark of amusement. Careful now, she warned. I like you, but there's only so much honor we'll tolerate. Anna. The blonde blinked, a spark of anger slipping through his carefully erected facade. I admire the concept, yes, until it gets you killed. Ned Stark was honorable, an honorable fool, and it cost him his head. No, my lady, I will do whatever it takes to preserve my house and my family. I may be a kind man, but I'm not a foolish one. I fight my enemies both on the battlefield as well as often I pluck them root and stem. Be thankful I don't count your granddaughter among them. She's mine now, and I'll protect her with My life, and that's meant to reassure me, is that the elderly Tyrell glowered. You could be little better than that pretentious child it is, he retorted waspishly, and I don't betray those I hold dear. Olenna considered him for a long agonizing moment. In the end she sighed and rose from the table. Death betrays everyone in the end. With that she departed in silence, her words soured as wine. You could say that the vision took Naruto while he was deep in his cups, nearly causing him to spit out the fine wine. 7 hells. Naruto's corpse stood slowly, woodenly, and without care. It shook itself like a wet dog, seemingly ignorant of the small array of crossbow bolts jutting from its back, of its missing arms, of the dead bodies at its feet. More than a few of them were frays, but perhaps worst of all was that the corpse was moving, speaking, breathing. No, it wasn't a corpse at all, but it had to be. They'd shoved a sword through his heart, stuck a full quiver of arrows in him, just as they had his wench. What sorcery was this? I told you to chop off my head or I'd come back to haunt you, Naruto whispered. But you, when he looked up, those eyes weren't blue, they were red and slitted. You, the eyes of a cat. No, something worse. You, just the vicious slits of an angry beast, wild and enraged. You, bottomless. You, the pits to hell. You didn't listen, you fucking idiot. A pair of red dots blossomed on his forehead, fingers sharpening into claws. You took her from me, stole her from me. His voice deepened as though another were speaking with him. No, through him, killed her from me despite his best efforts. Black Walder actually flinched back. Those eyes, what were those eyes? You'll burn for this. Reality reasserted itself with a rush of sound, leaving Naruto in a cold sweat. Glimpses of the waking dream, or was it a vision, haunted him, still lingering despite his best efforts to banish them. Flashes of sight and sound and pain lurked just out of sight, scraping against nerves, rubbed raw by the experience. Inwardly he began to curse. Of course, if the voices weren't tormenting him, it was the visions. This one had been clearer than most, crystalline in its clarity. He knew those were the twins. He recognized them from his childhood. Black Walder had only grown uglier with age. In the end, it wasn't hard to put 2 and 2 together. He'd seen a vision of his own death at Walder Frey's hands, a betrayal. White knuckled, he laid the goblet down, absently aware that he'd fallen of a stain on his doublet. He cared little for it. The wine tasted like ash in his mouth. Even now his mind was racing, struggling to decide what to do. His first instinct was to warn everyone, to tell father all he'd seen so that it might be avoided. That notion dashed itself against the cruel shore of reality. Who would believe him if he started going on about visions and voices in his head? Everyone would dismiss them out of turn. Worse, they might call them the ravings of the madman, and that was a scenario that would do more harm than good. And yet, if he said nothing, did nothing after what he'd seen just now, well, he'd put paid to whatever plans Walder Frey had for him and tear off as a hand laid itself across his chest. Look at you, you've gone white as a sheet. Ariane's voice snapped Naruto out of his reverie, and he jerked back with a start. Flailing, he nearly struck out at her. What one had she in his frazzled state? He realized she'd gotten incredibly close to him. She must have snuck up on him when he wasn't looking, or mayhap he'd simply failed to notice her of his own accord. Regardless, he didn't think to push her away. He could feel her warm hands on his face now, like twin suns, gently brushing upon his whiskered cheeks. Her forehead rested against his, her dark locks tickling his nose, breath hot on his face. Coming back to himself, Naruto was suddenly intensely glad that he had moved away from the main body of the festivities. If someone were to pass by and see this, it wouldn't bode well, my prince. Her voice oozed concern. It almost sounded genuine. Perhaps it was, perhaps she did care. Are you well? No, he croaked wearily, forcing his aching body into an upright position. But I will be eventually. Ariane's face brightened. Good, still you seem distressed. Shall I ease your burden? Her smile turned decidedly impish. That was his only warning then. Her mouth was simply there, moist and warm against his, as the princess flung both arms around his neck, her body crushed into his own, pushing him into an alcove. Even as her tongue thrust upon his, shielded as they were by the gardens. None saw them, none were made aware, none needed to be. There was only this moment, and one another. Nimble fingertips shifted and clenched, clinging tightly to hardened shoulders to pull him down to her, dragging him deeper into the searing kiss. In disbelief he took hold of her shoulders and pushed her away. Stop, he growled. 7 hells, I just got married. Do you have any idea? Eyes glazed. Ariane pushed back, driving him deeper into the dark. Rules, 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 she snapped at him when he tried to push her away again, nearly red-faced in her anger. That is all I hear from you. Why is it that you insist on following them? You are the prince, son of the king. It is you who should make the rules, not abide by them. Just let go. And who said anything about marriage? The princess purred, her expression turning coy. I'd be content as your mistress, or have you forgotten we do not shun bastards and adorn him now? That was a rather tempting in a way fist. slammed into the wall mere inches fro her face. Stop, or I'll make you, then make me, she whispered, kissing him again. Perhaps it was the anger, perhaps it stemmed from seeing her, perhaps he simply needed some relief from it all. Whatever the case, a fit of passion seized Naruto and his body betrayed him. Before he could think to stop himself, he was tired of fighting, of resisting, of having her parade herself before him, poking him, prodding him, teasing him without remorse. Perhaps that was the way of the Dornish, to tease, to entice, to tempt. Arianne had accomplished this well during the brief time she'd spent here in King's Landing, all the while knowing he couldn't do anything about it, couldn't yield, couldn't give in, because that wouldn't be prim and proper. People would talk. It was quite possible she hadn't expected Naruto's response to her advances. Time skip. Are you going to ride that dragon? Shireen's innocent inquiry caught Naruto at the worst possible moment. Were he more prone to suspicion and baseless paranoia? He might have thought it a deliberate act of malice on her part. She'd waited until they were long separated from the others before springing this on him. After all, was she teasing him? No, surely not. His little sister was too good to appear to have meant anything filthy by that question just now. The notion that she might actually be growing and taking an active interest in his life, and all those he'd brought into it, that came was anathema to him, inasmuch as the idea of leaving her in King's Landing alone, regardless her question, did cause him a bit of discomfort in the short run. Not only was he in the process of scoffing down the last remnants of a hasty meal as they rode ahead of the others, but now the sound of him spitting out said food caused his new mount to rear up in surprise. With a strangled whiny snarling, the prince hauled back on the stallion's reins and gripped the saddle with his legs, nearly biting his own tongue in his haste to calm the beast before it could launch him backward into the dirt. Naturally, the beast fought him every step of the way for control, further exasperating the situation. Only when he'd finally reined him in and was certain he wouldn't be breaking his neck did the fiery youth shoot his sibling a glower. There were so many dirty euphemisms for that phrase, he scarcely knew where to begin. What brought this about? Where did that come from? He hissed, clad in riding leathers and astride a small pony of her own. His dear sister merely tilted her head. What? I was simply curious. Brother Viserion seems to like you. It only makes sense that you'd be able to ride him when he's big enough. Oh, heat rose to his face. I thought you meant something else. An almost curious frown dawned on her marked face. Whatever did you think I meant? I'll tell you when you're older. Naruto coughed into a gloved fist. Much older. Somewhat taken aback by the fiery path his thoughts were now blazing, he stifled his initial urge to apologize and spurred Trampler forward into a swift canter. Content by the change of pace, his mount allowed itself to be goaded forward, leaving his sibling to click her tongue in admonishment and follow at her own pace. This gave him enough of a respite to turn his gaze back and make certain they hadn't left the rest of their escort in the dust, nor the others too far behind. Sure enough, a distant black trail wove across the road in the distance, creeping ever forward. Too far then, if he squinted hard enough, Naruto could just behold three familiar forms wheeling in the afternoon air, their wings barely discernible among the clouds. Distant cries came to him, carried on the wind as they called to one another, and for a moment he wondered what it must be like to simply fly away without a care, discontent with his sullen silence. However, Shireen caught up to him and favored him with a stern look. You're doing it again, doing what he feigned ignorance as they rode together. That thing you do when you're embarrassed, she pointed out. You always clam up. Somehow her words dragged a laugh out of him, and he reached out to muss her hair. I haven't the foggiest idea what you mean. Nudging his horse about, he pushed Trampler into an easy trot, reluctantly allowing his sibling to match him. Daenerys and Marjorie might well tear strips out of his hide if they thought he ran away. The thought was not without its merits, of course. There was something infinitely pleasing about having the open road sprawled before oneself. Here he didn't have to wear that infernal crown. Here he could do as he pleased. Here he was free, even if he was saddled with that infernal red woman. His mind bristled at the thought. Must she be here? Must he listen to her? Must she watch over him like some sort of mad minder? Was he not trusted enough to go about his own business, doing the king's work? At least if she was with him, it meant she wasn't near father, nor could she pour her poison in his ear. He could take some cold comfort in that, he supposed. Perhaps given time his head would clear, as he was rid of her so much so that he'd be glad to be rid of her entirely. Having chosen to eschew a carriage in favor of riding themselves, he could almost believe it. The journey to the twins would prove to be a long one and wasn't without its own perils. Thus they required guards, but did there have to be so many? Stannis had been adamant at the time, but he'd hoped to talk him down. Instead he found himself saddled with nearly 500 armed and Armored men a bit much perhaps, but he could understand father's caution. With so many present at Robb Stark's wedding, some might view it as a prime opportunity for treachery. Well, a small petty part of him preened, if Walder Frey tries anything he'll be in for quite the surprise. He had no intentions of releasing his weapons either. The old fool could fuss all he liked. Perhaps sensing the disquiet boiling within him, Shireen reached between their horses to tug at his sleeve. "You never answered my question, brother." A fiery brow rose. "Didn't I know you didn't?" With a flick of his wrist he nudged Trampler closer enough to bring himself well within arm's reach of his sister. Before she could guess at the stubborn glint lurking in his eyes, he pounced a decidedly unladylike yelp that followed as he plucked Shireen from the saddle and deftly plopped her into his lap was downright musical to his ears. Her pony didn't so much as whine a protest at the sudden absence of its rider. Rather, the tame beast happily took the opportunity to graze as the price made off with its stolen mistress. He'd done this countless times before in years past, yet Shireen still jolted all the same on the landing. "Brother, relax," he laughed when she nearly flailed. "I've got you." Shireen clicked her tongue in mild admonishment and swatted at his hands, but didn't deny him further. "You need to stop doing that," she said with an air of someone who was actually quite satisfied. "I'm getting too big. People will talk about what to." Her surprise, he roared with laughter and unbent enough to muss her hair with his offhand. "Spending time with my sister, Ba." Let them. They rode in silence for what felt like a comfortable eternity before he finally mustered up the nerve to speak again. "To answer you, I'm not sure, Viserion, and I just get on well. Not much else to it. Sides, he's not quite large enough to be ridden safely yet. None of them are much." To Naruto's surprise, the confession came quite candidly to him in spite of his fears. Veritably springing forth from his lips, he nearly said he'd never ridden a dragon at all, but that was slightly less than true. If he said that aloud and word got out, well, he'd yet to test the limits of Dany's patience. But if he started boasting like a braggart, he suspected she truly would tear something out of his hide. "In the bedroom he always comes when you whistle," she pointed out. The rare ghost of a smile brushed his lips again. "No, he doesn't." Shireen must have taken that as a challenge, for she put two fingers to her lips and did just that. Naruto scowled. "Hey, why did you?" Scarce had he spoken than the dragon in question swooped in to settle upon his shoulders with a high trill, both of them grimacing both beneath the dragon's growing bulk as much as the sharp claws biting into the straps of his armor. The prince nevertheless stoically bore the weight for all of 5 seconds before he gave up and flailed spectacularly. "Viserion, off, you're too heavy for that." He hadn't known a dragon could look smug until this very moment. Rather than take flight, the young dragonling merely snorted and hopped off him to alight upon the saddle. Instead, Trampler offered an irritated snort at this unexpected guest, but proved surprisingly tolerant of his presence. Viserion visibly preened at what he no doubt viewed as a submission to his dominance. "Wait, was he smirking?" Dragons were much more difficult to read than people know. That was definitely a touch of pride in those amber eyes. A hand settled over his. "They are growing quickly, aren't they?" A familiar voice hummed with a jolt. Naruto realized their slow canter must have finally carried them back to the main body of the caravan, but beyond that, to the mother of dragons herself. He hadn't even heard Daenerys nor her approach until she made herself known to him just now. Judging by Shireen's faux innocent expression, he suspected she'd seen her coming quite a ways away, and had chosen to remain silent if only to get him back in recompense for his earlier temerity. There would be a reckoning for that later. He swore. "Pranks, loads of them. You're staring." Dany's voice jerked him back to reality. "I am, aren't I?" He offered a small dismayed chuckle. "Shouldn't be doing that." As always, he found himself briefly taken aback by the sight of her astride her gray mare. She wasn't wearing armor, though he'd insisted that she at least carry a knife on her person for some semblance of protection. But that blue dress, well, it very much became her. That blazing gaze met his in challenge. Her chin lifted just so as she awaited a response. In that moment, the waning sunlight caught her pale hair and seemed to set it afire from within, wreathing her head in a burning halo. She was life and defiance personified, and something deep within him warmed at the look she was giving him. Spirits, this would take some getting used to. Much to Naruto's chagrin, his mind blanked. Gods above, this was his wife, as was Marjorie, who thankfully hadn't chosen to make an appearance beside Dany. Yet he wasn't sure what he would do if they decided to gang up on him, right? Because that would happen sooner or later. How on earth had father managed being married to just one person? Too was madness. He was suddenly intensely glad that he'd left Arianne back in King's Landing. If she were here, he had no doubt that he would be undone by the three of them. Yet he'd given his word, his oath, his honor, and despite his slip, he'd since resolved that he would hold to it for as Long as he was able, even if it destroyed him. Daenerys's gaze shifted. Might I steal him for a moment? She inquired of Shireen. His sibling offered a small nod and slid from the saddle with practiced ease. He's all yours, she preened, quite satisfied with her handiwork. Thanks for the ride, Naruto absolutely hissed as his sister skipped away from them, traitor. But then Daenerys took his hand again, and he found himself very much occupied with other matters that didn't involve his sibling. He let her trail his palm over Viserion's hide, the scalebound flesh rippling with movement. The dragon trilled happily, rubbing its head against his chest. The prince grunted and stumbled back, momentarily surprised by its strength to be so young and so large already. These dragons were going to be monsters when they grew older, and if they laid eggs that subsequently hatched, well, that went without saying. The Baratheons had the means to forge an everlasting dynasty if they played their cards right. Indeed, it might even lead to a return of the great beasts themselves. Just the thought made him shiver with quiet anticipation. You could ride him someday if you like, Daenerys offered, sensing his quiet longing. Naruto stiffened at the implied promise. You're going to ruin horses for me. I hope you know that, among other things, and whatever might those be, not one to be outdone. She favored him with a long searching look, as much an invitation as it was a challenge. And there it was. If there was one aspect in which the mother of dragons truly eclipsed Naruto, it was her pride. Marjorie had her wit, and truly he loved her for it, but Daenerys Targaryen could be just so damned stubborn at times, and he adored that about her. He had his moments, of course, but at the end of the day he was willing to set his ego aside for the greater good of the realm. Daenerys still grappled really with it in the day-to-day. It was part of the reason he empathized with her as strongly as he did. They'd both come from next to nothing. He loud bastard boy with nothing to his name, and she an exiled princess living in fear for her every waking moment. No one had thought anything of them in the eyes of the world. They were nothing, no less than nothing. Thus those in power were quite taken by surprise when those they thought to be nothing rose up and cast them down. They'd fought for every inch of power they now possessed. She was the last Targaryen that the world knew of raised to trust in no one but herself, thrust into an alliance against her will, one that was only just beginning to blossom into something more. She might bend at times perhaps to a wise counsel and sage advice, but never would she break. Naruto wouldn't deny her that he would do his best to live with her, to love her just as he did Marjorie, but he could at least work to curb some of her more dangerous tendencies. And yet, for all her fire, she was open with him. They were equals in this, and she knew it. Perhaps she saw a bit of herself in him as he did in her. They each had their own faults, their own failings. They'd come to what was the word, an understanding. Yes, that remarkably Littlefinger's machinations, may he prowl the void forevermore, had proved a boon to them both. Regardless if she didn't expect to pounce, not to pick up the gauntlet she'd just thrown down, she was going to be disappointed. He was all too happy to nip her little taunt in the bud before she got the better of him, or better yet, return the favor tenfold. Leaning in across their horses, he pulled her in close, forehead resting against hers. Well, now that you mention it, his lips brushed her ear as he continued to speak, whispering softly of just what he intended for her. Daenerys gave a small shiver in her saddle, but made no move to pull away. On the contrary, she proved all too happy to meet his words with actions. At this, Viserion offered a questioning trill, only to find himself summarily ignored by both parties, each lost in one another, irritated by what he viewed as a blatant and inexcusable lapse on their parts. The dragon gave a small hiss and loudly took wing, finally startling them apart. Pity. Naruto caught himself feigning a sigh. And here I'd thought to have my way with you. A small bemused smile rewarded him for his attempt at humor. You truly can be a bastard sometimes, can't you? Her laugher warmed him more than sunshine. Tell me something I don't know. Time skip. Arya found the prince at sunset, slender fingers of waning fire stretched out across half-clouded skies in their last dying gasp, vainly trying find themselves a handhold to save themselves as the sun slipped beyond the horizon. Still the night crept in with inexorably calm and relentless, in spite of the sun's valiant efforts to stay in the sky, and the field grew darker with each step. All told, that great blazing orb, rather the sinking sliver that remained, painted itself a beautiful if somber picture as they stood upon down the hill overlooking his camp. Do you think Robb is down there somewhere? She murmured almost to herself, searching in vain for the colors of her house. Truly the Stark girl could have stared all day, and likely would have for quite some time yet if left to her own devices. Her companion didn't share her fascination with the sunset. With nary a grunt he shouldered past her and started down the hill himself, leaving her to hasten after him with a cry. Hey, she yelped, wait for me, you big oaf. Walk faster than the hound. Didn't even deign to look back. We haven't got all damn day. Arya Puffed, you're the worst shit in the 7 kingdoms. Sometimes you know that. Ba came the immediate rejoinder, plenty worse than me. Now keep up. Even as the exhausted girl trotted after Sandor's rapidly retreating back, she found she still had a remarkable view of the land as they descended into the controlled chaos below. The train of servants carrying barrels of ale and wine to the gate, the distant torchlight flickering in preparation for the coming night, the faint sounds of laughter and the scent of food teasing her nose. Her stomach growled in responsive bleating, a plaintive note of quiet discord as they grew gods. She was hungry. Framed in the light of fading day, she saw the tents, the horses, the men, and each of them goggled at them. Pitched just short of the twins and the towering shadows they cast, a sprawling series of pitched tents lurked near those great towers, and their bridge looming large in the distance, a field of gold and black and yellow and even red sprinkled among them heraldry she both knew and didn't recognize. She knew the Baratheon sigil well from her time in King's Landing, but this one was different. The stag itself was set afire within a heart of flame. Others eluded her utterly. Who did the rose belong to again? Or the huntsman? Was that an onion? So many banners, and each set her mind spinning. Eleanor, their guide and former shield maiden, had slipped away to gods knew where last hours ago, leaving them to fend for themselves in the chaos of the royal camp and its countless followers. So fen they did, trying not to draw attention to themselves. Many eyes followed them as they threaded their way through the tents, no doubt drawn by the hound's horrifically scarred visage, but despite the initial curiosity, no one dared challenge them, as they were, well, if it isn't the bloody hound, she'd spoken too soon, for fuck's sake. Rounding on the sound, and the one who called to them, Arya nearly drew needle, but it was the hound, who swore after so many months on the run her first instinct was to do just that, to run, to place as much distance between her and this stranger as possible. It was only Clegane's annoyed grunt that stayed her feet where they stood. If there was any true danger, he would have drawn that big sword of his and attacked by now, or so she reasoned. The faint recognition and irritation in his voice soothed her frayed nerves somewhat. She'd never seen this man in her life, but apparently the hound had, because he immediately moved to place himself between her and the newcomer. What in the 7 hells are you doing here? Not shoveling Lannister shit anymore, that's for certain. The newcomer shot back. There was a certain swagger to his step, a staid boldness bordering on arrogance, but only just. Here was a man who grinned as though he'd just been given great news. In comparison to her heavily armored companion, he stood clad in simple boiled leathers, over which he'd thrown a black coat, and an equally dark pair of trousers and boots, strong thumbs hooked in his belt, and a sword at his side. He radiated surety of purpose and lithe strength of middle age. With dark hair and worn face, he looked decidedly roguish. Even so, Arya never would have taken him for a mercenary or a turncoat, a hired killer, nor a murderer of men. She would come to revise that opinion soon enough. Braun of the fucking Blackwater, the last Clegane growled, though the latter was favored with a nasty smile. Looks like you're shoveling Baratheon shit these days. No, don't you start running your mouth, said Sellsword, shook his finger at them, still grinning in spite of the verbal jab. You're not going to ruin this for me, Clegane. I'm getting Casterly Rock when all this is over, and no amount of ribbing on your part's going to change that. With a laugh, he crossed the lingering distance between them. And I haven't seen you since ran away with your tail between your legs back at King's Landing, ha. But look at you now. Much to Arya's chagrin, the man wasn't just bold enough to insult the hound to his face, he actually stalked right up to him and clapped on the back as if they were old friends. Now you've got a royal pardon and one of the last Starks with you. That shrewd assessing gaze flicked her up and down. Seems you're doing well for yourself. Well enough. If Sandor had further answers for him, he was loath to give them. Aha, understanding dawned in those shrewd eyes. That's what you've been doing then? Braun quirked another brow, protecting her. A strange emotion stole over the hound's face, as though he were shocked to hear the words spoken aloud himself. Arya fought down a secret little smile of her own. Clegane relented at last, hardening his face to hide his shock. That's what I'm doing now. Where's the fucking prince? Little shit promised me a reward if I brought her back to her brother. Softier smirk must have been telling, or perhaps Braun shared the same thought, because he waggled a dark brow at her and didn't call him on his bluff. Right over there, the lord to be laughed, jerking a thumb over his shoulder to indicate a distant in the midst of the camp. Give him my regards, and tell him we brought the last of the barrels up to the twins, would you? It's the red one with all the heraldry, dragons and stags and roses all over. Can't miss it. The unlikely duo exchanged a dismayed glance. Roses, Arya mouthed in abject horror with a wave and a whistle. Braun happily left them to their own devices. Good luck. Try not to piss off the dragons. They're in a mood today. Arya's short-lived disgust at the idea of roses died a swift death the moment he mentioned dragons. They were real at The end of the day she still held true to the tales told by old Nan, and the mere mention of legendary winged beasts was enough to provoke her curiosity to the fullest. Sandor's reaction proved decidedly muted by comparison. Rolling his eyes, he gently but firmly dragged her to the prince's tent, earning a bemused look from the guards posted there and pausing just long enough to par the flap that served as an entrance, but not enough to end her. "Fuckery you doing?" Clegane growled at her. The little Stark rammed a finger against her lips for silence, and remarkably the wounded warrior complied with that. Arya tentatively poked her head inside to survey her surroundings. What she found within was large enough, more than a dozen men and women. Ironic considering the amount of bodies within. She goggled at the sprawling expanse and its occupants within, but none more so than the one speaking. "Enough barrels," someone was murmuring as she strained her ears to hear. Another chuckled. "More than enough barrels." Remember, once again that low drawling voice rolled through her ears. "We have to let Walder Frey make the first move, predicting and countering them's all well and good, but if we attack first, half the bloody Seven Kingdoms will spit on the lot of us. I'm sure no one here wants that." A smattering of agreement answered, and Arya craned her neck to see the speaker. Amidst the sea of bodies she found him readily enough at the table. This was the prince. All told, she had expected him to be taller. With a voice like thunder and lightning shooting from his eyes, someone who could disappear into the shadows without a trace, that sort of thing. Given the tall tales told her by Eleanor, coupled with wild rumors they'd heard on the road, she had already painted herself a picture of the young monarch in her mind. The young man that she found instead didn't quite live up to her expectations. True, he commanded a certain sense of presence, and he was certainly loud and boisterous enough, but in the end he was just a man. Unlike his many guards, he was only lightly armored in hunting leathers. Were it not for the sword at his side, she would have thought him a fool. Looked like he knew how to use it too. So did his guard at first. She, though the one beside him, must be a giant, if only because he dwarfed everyone else in the tent. But no, for all his burly appearance and great bristling beard, this was a man, a large one perhaps, but still a man, nevertheless armed, and armored to the teeth. Bodyguard, her keen mind labeled him instantly. Here was someone charged with the prince's protection, someone quite capable indeed. He might have been able to give the mountain himself a run for his money. Who knew? He turned at their approach, exposing his legion questions. The prince himself stood hunched over a massive table, hands splayed before an etched map, keen blue eyes focused upon the pieces arrayed there. Planning for the worst as always, she heard the imp's voice groan, though she nearly missed him near the head of the table. "Why am I not surprised? You act as if we're all going to die tonight." Silence reigned, and he risked a glance at their impromptu council. "By your own admission, Walder Frey is a coward at heart. Surely there's no need to exterminate his entire house in retaliation." All eyes turned toward the hand of the king, followed by more than a few muttered curses, and the dwarf downed the last of his wine with sigh. "Tell me," Tyrion, Naruto's own keen blue gaze cut into him with the intensity of a thousand gleaming knives, "what do you know of your father? Have you heard the reigns of Castamere ring any bells?" "Fair enough," he relented blackly, raising his goblet. "I may have spoken out of turn. Family will always be my greatest weakness. I suppose a toast to my own foolishness. To answer your question, my lord father," and here dwarf continued with a black look, "for the mere mention of his sire's cruelty still deeply unsettled him to this very day, is never the sort to let a debt go unpaid. If you think he'll go so far as to make use of the young wolf's wedding visit to strike at you, then who am I to object? That reminds me." The prince immediately seized on the opportunity to brighten the mood of his drinking companion. "When is your wedding? She needs a present." Tyrion choked on his wine and pounded on his chest as his wife to be hummed happily at his side. "While I appreciate your gratitude, that's not necessary." "Nonsense." The prince slammed a fist down on the table, causing several goblets and pieces to jump. "I won't hear of it. Name anything within reason, of course, and you'll have it by sundown tomorrow." "I never go back on my word." "As your grace commands." "Hi." When Naruto crowed triumphantly, "Honestly, you can be such a boy sometimes." Arya's gaze shifted toward a beautiful woman with startling red hair as she moved to his right side and made herself known. Something clicked in the back of her mind. She remembered Eleanor mentioning a woman like that once. That must be the Tyrell woman. Then who were the others? Then gods, it was hard to keep track of them all with that great big boulder of a man blocking most of her view. Again, she had to stand on the very tips of her toes just to see some of them, and even then her view was compromised by the black bulk lingering near the tent's entrance. A cheeky grin flashed back at her. "Would you have me any other way?" Marjorie palmed her face. "I suppose not," she amended after a moment's thought, threading her fingers with those of the prince's. Laughter reminded her of the Fat King. So did the eyes beyond that. She didn't see the family resemblance where King Robert had been heavy with food and drink. This was a young man in the prime of life, all corded muscle and razor wit lurking behind a kindly smile. His hair had been dark and his beard thick as a briar bush. Naruto bore no such beard, and his hair looked as though it were cut from fire itself. He didn't much look like Stannis. Either was he a bastard then like Jon. The thought made her wonder. And if they don't attack one of the men, a general perhaps asked bluntly, "Forgive my discourtesy, your grace, but this seems quite the risk." Her gaze flitted to a grim-looking man near the large one and glimpsed a gaunt yet hardy-looking man in unfamiliar livery, his dark eyes fixed firmly upon the prince. "Then you've given your men a brisk march across the countryside for nothing, Randall?" That scowl slipped into a sly sardonic smile. "Your job is to keep Marjorie safe in the likely even that our lovely host turns on us here." He slid a trio of icons across the map. "You and your men will ride down and lay waste to the twins. I trust you can see to that task now." "Then why go to all this trouble?" Then a woman's sultry voice inquired, just out of her sight. "You'll be placing yourself in harm's way for nothing. It all seems unnecessary." "Not for nothing, Danny." The prince's gentle rebuke put paid to her question. "You forget I was fostered here for a time, and I know how Walder Frey thinks." The old man's a right bitter old bastard who doesn't give a flying fig for anyone or anything until you slight him. Robb Stark did more than slight him. He all but spat in his face when he took that girl into his bed. Never mind the king in the north, the crown princess and the princesses. That's a prize Frey won't be able to pass up. Neither will Tywin Lannister. You've thought this through. He who passes the sentence must swing the sword. A good deed does not wash out the bad," the young man muttered, causing Arya's ears to prick up. "Nor does a bad wash out the good. I'm not much for strategy, but I understand the basics. Are we all agreed on our parts?" "By my reckoning that's beyond basic." The weathered sailor at his left shook his head. "You're more like your father than you care to admit. Praising me won't change your role." Davos Naruto gave him a small smile. "Now about your ships, oh for fuck's sake move already." But the hound had clearly had enough eavesdropping, and barged into the tent heedless of the bemused looks his unannounced arrival garnered. Least of all the prince himself. Those piercing blue eyes lit up at the sight of them, and with a shooing gesture he dismissed many of the tent's occupants. Only Marjorie and the giant man lingered, though Tyrion paused long enough to sketch her a small bow. Arya flicked him a small uneasy smile just before the object of her attention knelt before her. "Aha, there's the man of the hour," he beamed. "You must by Arya Stark. Your brother will be glad to see you. I thought you'd be taller," she said for lack of anything else. A blonde brow rose. "You're definitely a Stark." Sandor Clegane had never been one to wax poetic. Even as Arya realized what was about to happen, the hound had already moved. Rather than approach the prince, he made a beeline for the giant whose helmeted head turned to face him in stoic silence. A brief note of tension swelled in the room as he glowered up at him. "You're a big fucker." These words escaped the scarred warrior in a flat growl. "Almost remind me of my brother," she half expected the massive man to laugh. Instead he removed his helm, exposing his bearded face to the world and his identity. Much to the hound's consternation, it became clear then, despite the rumors he'd heard and longed for, that this was not his sibling. A shame that it was almost disappointing. He would have relished the chance to cut him down to size. The words that followed stole even that faint hope away. "I the mountain who rides Ulrich," grinned toothily. "He's dead." "Sorry about that." At this Arya watched the hound falter briefly. He swayed back half a step before steadying himself again. "Nothing more." She saw something spark in his hideous face just then, an ember of wrath igniting behind those dark eyes. She knew it well. Hate, nor for their deed or his brother, but at what he'd been denied, his satisfaction. He'd wanted to kill him. She realized now that had been taken away from him, and he would never know the joy of vengeance that he'd so craved. He almost reached for his blade. "Easy there, Clegane," Naruto drawled softly. "If it makes you feel any better, he suffered before he died immensely." For a moment she thought he might actually stab the prince. With an effort his fist uncurled from sword's hilt. "I want details," he growled. "And you'll have them," the prince promised. "But you've come a long way. Hungry might be." A hearty chicken leg sailed his way in response, and the foul-mouthed soldier deftly snatched it out of the air. Not a heartbeat later, he was sinking his teeth into it in contented silence. He made way gladly as the prince fell back, and Arya found the source of the strange trilling. It had been a faint sound idly tugging at her senses, but she'd paid it little mind until now. Naruto and his men had accidentally blocked her view from the southern side of the room and thus kept someone out of sight no longer. "Aren't you going to introduce us?" a new voice inquired. Right. Where are my manners?" Turning she saw her. "May I present my wife Daenerys of the House Targaryen and Marjorie of the House Tyrell Arya had already seen the red-headed woman, but not this one, not her. At the end of the tent, a woman with pale hair and bright eyes lounged in a chair that almost resembled a throne. Her white dress was pristine, exposing a silver chain and the pale expanse of one shoulder. She was beauty and grace personified, yet the sight of her also paled in comparison to those that surrounded her. Even the greatest of kings and queens couldn't hope to compare to the creature resting its head in her lap. Her dragons brought the Stark girl up short, three of them. One of them was larger than the others, a great black beast already larger than her that reclined near the tent's entrance. She'd been so close, but in the dim lighting hadn't seen it until this very moment. Its siblings lounged about the room in a similar state, one green, the other almost white gold, resting its long neck atop her legs with a contented trill. Arya caught herself gaping, nearly taken aback by the sight of them, almost reaching out to touch them. Such was her shock. Actual dragons, Vala Morguli, she muttered to herself, not because the saying applied here, but because here in this moment Arya Stark realized a fundamental truth. Men would die to these creatures in droves, dozens and hundreds and thousands, beasts of legend and myth brought back into the world, and she was looking at them, seeing them here for the first time in her life. Daenerys favored her with a wry, almost knowing look. Indeed, she hummed, "All men must die." She graced her with a smile. "Then, but we are not men." Time skip. Today was a good day to die. Robb Stark had absolutely no intention of meeting the gods so long as he could stave them off, but if that was to be his fate, he would meet them tonight, sword in hand and grey wind at his side. He had tried so very hard and gotten so very far on his mettle alone. Now he need only survive this sham of a wedding for the sake of maintaining appearances. Then he would never venture this far south again. He felt out of his element in this place when he wanted nothing more than to take his men and march home. Walder Frey be damned. Perhaps he'd visit Jon at the Wall after this, surprise him with an unannounced visit. Ghost would be happy to see his sibling too. Robb rather liked the sound of that thought right now. He longed to be anywhere but here. As if sensing that very thought, grey wind growled beside him. A rueful smile stole over the Northman's visage. "I know, boy," he murmured, stroking the direwolf's fur in a futile attempt to soothe his companion. "Just put up with it for a little while longer. We'll go north soon, further north than he'd ever been before, to the Wall, to see Jon. Gods, it had been so long since he'd last seen any of his siblings. Stannis might well have returned Sansa to them, but years in King's Landing had hardened her. She was taller, leaner. A light had gone out in those once gentle eyes, one that might never be kindled again. Gone was the naive, grinning girl he remembered from Winterfell, dead as surely as father. In her place only a ghost remained. She'd gained a mind for politics from her tenure in the South, and he hadn't the heart to deny her so long as push the interest of the North. He'd suffered so much for his country, for his kingdom, with so little to show for it. Yes, they were independent. Yes, they had a strange friend in the crown. Yes, the Lannisters had paid for their treachery tenfold, and yet some nights he wished father had just stayed in the damn North, where he belonged, where they belonged, and that none of this had ever happened. If wishes could change the world, gazing up at twins tonight reminded him of the last time he'd crossed here so long, and the price paid to pass the crossing. He'd forfeited Arya's future to a Frey and named her a future wife to a boy she hadn't even met, one that would one day be her husband. If the truce was upheld, he himself would take Rosalind Frey as his betrothed to be wed once the war was won. But Arya was still missing, and Robb had broken his vow for love. He did not regret wedding Talisa for a moment, but he was glad he hadn't brought her here. This was a foul place now. Those terrible towers loomed before him in the gloom, just as they had all those days ago. Still as squat and ugly as their lord. No, that was unfair of him. He had forsaken his oath to Walder Frey, and this was his way of making amends. Without it the wretched old man would never forgive the slight, and who knew where that might lead? Not that he seemed to be in much of a hurry to avenge his honor. If he were, no doubt he would have all around Robb. The world heaved with bodies, Tully and Stark and Baratheon and Frey alike, the air rich with laughter as men and women drank, yet it was subdued on the Northman's part. Controlled Robb's elite, those who could be trusted to hold their tongues even under duress, quietly wore hidden mail beneath their clothes, hands on their swords, as they awaited any sign of treachery. Others were left with standing orders not to get roaring drunk in camp, at least not without a sober escort. They did not eat any food but their own, shipped in packed containers and seasoned with salt. Those who disobeyed or were otherwise incapable of denying their vices were given the switch. Thus far they seemed to be obeying, for now with an effort he willed himself to exhale. Sansa was safe, his mother was safe, Talisa was safe, and so too was the babe burrowed in her belly. They were all safe and secure in a now restored Winterfell guarded by good men, loyal men of the north. The women of his family were ensconced within its great walls, far, far away from this awful place, safe and secure in the north. No one, nothing could take that from him. If their new luck yet held Bran and Rickon, and maybe even Arya herself might yet be found by the king's men, their once fractured family was slowly being welded back together by the winds of change from King's Landing, and the impossible alliance that came with it. One way or another this ended tonight. Even if he fell here today, even if Walder Frey proved himself the duplicitous weasel half the realm thought him to be, the old codger would gain nothing for his treachery but his head. He thought Robb's family traveled with him and were thus coming to the feast, and thus vulnerable and ugly deception, perhaps one Robb didn't hesitate to use as a shield for his family. Perhaps if the old Frey thought all the Starks had assembled here, he might grow overbold, he might make mistakes. By the time he learned the truth, it would be too late. He would either slink back into his hole or strike. Robb had not thought him capable of breaking guest right, but the prince argued otherwise. He owed that one a great deal, a debt that might never be repaid. This would be a start. Surely would 1,500 men be enough to dissuade Walder Frey's foolishness, who knew many of the men had gone home long before the wedding. Roose Bolton mourned the loss of his heir, yet with no body to show for it. Some whispered that Ramsay Snow yet lived, that he was out there somewhere harassing Lannister soldiers, but they weren't the enemy at the moment. The Freys were the royal party, had spent several days waiting for them as it were. Now that he'd finally arrived, Robb found himself strangely reluctant to present himself before him. If only father were alive to see this, surely he would have known what to a dragon's roar shattered the world. The young wolf rounded on the sound, and Grey Wind winced under his hand. Aha, a rough, pleasant voice drawled, "There you are, your grace, we've been waiting for you." Sure enough, he found the prince approaching him from the southern end of camp. That didn't concern him. The dragon did. He glimpsed the pale beast behind him, nearly large enough to carry a grown man, wings tucked at its side. As it slunk along behind him, it trilled happily, and the men parted before it like the sea. Some too far into their cups even dared to touch it at the young man's bidding. Gorgeous beast, Robb mused. If they were here, then their mother was likely somewhere in the camp. They would have been a boon in the early days of the war. His direwolf growled, whirly hackles rising at the sight of the beast, already larger than him, but the dragon merely snorted. "Gods, they were big. Don't worry about Viserion," Naruto said with a smile. "He's been fed." Robb considered the growing dragon with mild trepidation. His kneeling was only slightly forced in that regard. "Your grace, none of that. Get on your feet." Man's strong hands grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him up again. A king should not bow to a prince. A few years ago Robb might have agreed, but he owed this man a debt, one he could never truly repay. With some reluctance he allowed the prince to pull him back to his feet. Viserion watched him like a hawk through the entire exchange, those keen slitted eyes never leaving him. The Northman felt his right hand twitch. In Grey Wind's coat, clever beast, far too smart by half. How long had it been since the world had seen their like? And now there were three of them, perhaps more. "You can touch him if you want," the prince prodded. "He's not quite as feisty as his brothers." "I'm not sure I should." Naruto arched an eyebrow. "Are you wearing mail under your clothes like I told you to?" "You're mad." A muscle jumped in Robb's jaw. "That dragon will bite right through it. You know that." "Ba Viserion won't bite unless I tell him to." The prince reassured him pointedly. "Go on, he's harmless." Although his own gaze stretched longingly to Grey Wind, who still hadn't budged. A strange, almost childish longing bloomed in those blue orbs. "May I just be careful?" he warned. "He's not much fond of strangers." "Why, your grace," the bastard guffawed, "I'll have you know I'm the very soul of discretion." "Somehow I doubt that it's your hand then." Robb demurred with a long-suffering sigh, and in a moment Wolf and Stag traded places. Viserion stiffened as his chosen partner stepped away, but did not otherwise protest when the king in the north moved to lay a wondering hand upon his head. Naruto likewise removed his glove to thread a palm through the fur of a reluctant Grey Wind. Robb silently prayed his old friend wouldn't take it into his head to bite that hand off. He'd have no end of trouble explaining that one to the king, nor did he himself want to witness dragon fire firsthand. "Gorgeous beast," the prince murmured reverently. "It's a shame we don't have more of them. Could you imagine a whole pack of them?" Those words drew a flinch from Robb. Briefly he thought of the rest of his brother's pack. Ghost was likely still with Jon on the wall, but what of Summer and Shaggy Dog? Lost with Bran and Rickon. Sansa had returned to them, but Lady was gone, and Nymeria missing with Arya. Like all of them scattered and lost. "Did you know I was fostered here once upon a time?" That caught Robb's attention, piquing his interest enough to draw him from his melancholy and turn his attention back to the prince. "You were. I wasn't much to look at back then," came the mild reply as he scratched behind Grey Wind's right ear. "I was just a boy when my father shipped me out here." Not out of a sense of kinship or anything, I suppose he just wanted me out of his hair. I'd been caught with one of the serving girls, you see, and the great Lord Stannis didn't like that not one bit. I suppose he thought of this as a punishment. A distant trill drew his attention, and he briefly glimpsed a black dragon winging with one of its brothers through the dark skies above. We didn't see eye to eye even back then, Naruto. Drawing his attention once more. I hated it here, swore to make myself miserable just to spite him, and I nearly did. His hand threaded through Grey Wind's coat, those once keen blue eyes turning almost foggy with memory. Then I fell in love. She was a sweet girl, sweet on me, and I on her. Walder forbid it, of course. He's a right prick like that. No, he lent no further thought to giving one of his few prettier daughters to some bastard boy until she threw herself from the twins. I left the next day. Never thought I'd come back. I wonder if Rosalind still makes those pies. Rosalind, oh gods, this was going to be awkward. Rob twitched and a sullen silence arose betwixt them. Oh, Naruto blinked. That's right, you were going to marry her, weren't you? He wanted to crawl into the dirt and die, maybe then his face would stop burning. The prince looked far too pleased with himself, as though he were subject to some secret joke he didn't know about. There wasn't a cruel quality to it, just the teasing glint of one man to another. Your loss, I'm afraid. His smile was decidedly impish. She was a beautiful girl even back then. I suspect lords would kill to have her hand now, perhaps in another time. Cutting himself short, he shook his head. I envy you. You know you married for love, not duty or honor. A wistful smile and perhaps a hint of jealousy flitted across the prince's face. The latter he outright admitted to. I'm almost envious, if only because I had no say in mine. One I was forced to marry for duty in the realm, and the other, if I hadn't said anything, she would have died. His lips peeled in a grimace. The things we do for love, granted, I've come to care for them both now, but it wasn't easy in the beginning. Marriages, Naruto actually flushed. Yes, he groaned, palming his face. Plural, I care deeply for them, but there is such a thing as being too noble. I'll not take a third, so help me. Rob imagined father's last moments, those frantic seconds before the sword came down on his head. Had his nobility killed him? And what had he done? As if he were any better. He hadn't followed his heart, no, not at first. He just followed his cock. Love came later. Love came when he saw her gentleness and free spirit, her courage and her kindness. He croaked, I suppose you may be right, but why are you here? In response, Vizirion's long neck arched under Rob's hand. He had all of a second to step backward. Even then the backswing of those leathery wings nearly caught him in the head. In moments the dragon took flight, soaring into the sky to join its brothers. Naruto watched him go with a rueful smile and finally took his hand from Grey Wind's coat, pausing just long enough to deliver one quick pat. Can I not pay an old friend a visit? Rob didn't bat an eyelash. All right, geez, that glare is downright deadly. I'm merely making the rounds, the young lord confessed with a small smile. They say gifts and surprises has a way of keeping men loyal. His slim shoulders rolled in a small shrug. I just like making people happy. It's a bit of a bad habit with me, you see. Might have something to do with being born a bastard. He meant it too, though. Those wild blue eye open creased in a sly wink. They held not a notch of duplicity. You're first, and it's a grand give I have for you. I don't understand. Rob blinked. What gift? In response, Naruto whistled sharply, to which the king in the north had just enough time to blink. Then a small blur canonied into the young wolf. Rocking him back on his heels, he heard Arya's voice, and his world shattered. Rob, his arms tightened around her as she babbled happily in his ear, unable to do anything else but sob. He couldn't move, couldn't think, could scarcely even breathe, such was his shock. Arya, God, she'd grown. He almost didn't believe it was her until her voice cut through his doubts. No, she shouldn't be here. It wasn't safe. Walder Frye would try to take advantage of this, of the chaos of the wedding and all the noise. Wait, he didn't hear anything. He didn't hear anything. In place of the crass carousing in camp, the world had gone quiet, almost deathly so, as if the whole realm were holding its breath. A strange nameless dread welled up in him, and he pushed a confused Arya, heedless of her question, behind his back. Perhaps he might yet have said more were it not for the sudden scrape of steel escaping a scabbard. Something's wrong. The words escaped him on a hiss. It's too quiet. Listen, I know. Naruto hummed. Draw his own. It's all part of the plan. Best draw your sword. Your plan. He heard them now, a distant buzz of noise, of enraged roars trailing off into shrieks. Naruto's head bobbed, a small smile blooming in his eyes. Tell me, are you familiar with basilisk blood? I have heard of it. Rob relented. Maester Lewin had mentioned it once, and the name had stuck with him. Season on meat. It drove men mad with rage. But why? A great shadow swept past him, and the young wolf's back tensed as he beheld the towering form of Ulrich striding through. The man had his sword drawn, but it hung loose at his side, heedless of the blood Staining it with a wordless grunt, he bowed before his prince and took up his vigil beside him. Then came another, and another, still surrounding them. "We're ready, my lord," the giant boomed. "It's as you said." The phrase "attacked first." He planned this. The words echoed in Robb's head as his own mien surged up behind him. "All along he planned this." Good. The prince took 3 steps forward, brandishing his blade. His shadows silently moved as one to follow their lord. "And liege, how unfortunate it seems." All the phrase outside the twins lost their minds. His voice dripped with smarmy sardonic snark as he glanced over his shoulder. "Such a shame that so many turned on their guests in a drunken rage. Don't you think, Lord Stark, how wise of us to be prepared for it? Walder Frey will welcome us into his hall, and when does the blind fool won't even realize have his armies been gutted? Should he turn on us, we'll be ready for that too." Robb regarded him with horror. "You planned this?" The words finally escaped him. "Too late, I did." "Yes," came the immediate rejoinder, blue eyes dancing in the torchlight. "Mind you, we weren't fool enough to poison every bit of food just outside the towers. You'll find the food within quite untainted, and all the drink as well. We have a different plant for the late Lord Frey." At this, Arya finally stirred enough to wriggle out of his arms. "You're going to kill them all, aren't you?" Robb and Naruto rounded on her in the same moment, only the latter smiled back. "Quite good." Her gaze hardened. "If they were going to kill us first, they deserve to die." "Arya, this isn't honorable." Robb recoiled in horror. Naruto scoffed. "Honor?" Those warm blue eyes turned to ice. "You speak to me of honor? Honor means nothing in war, and make no mistake, we're still very much at war. I did this to save you. You didn't know he would. You seem to be laboring under a delusion, brother." A hand clamped down on his shoulder, and those blazing blue eyes bored into own. "Walder Frey was going to get you, shoot you full of crossbow bolts until you fell at his feet. I saw it in my dreams. As far as I'm concerned, the poison merely revealed their true motives. Let his sons fall. Their lord father will join them soon enough." Without another word he departed. "I don't ask for your forgiveness, only your trust. Come and see the truth." Robb wasn't sure why he listened, what spurred him to follow this fool madman, but he did. That bitter wry laugh was one of the last things Robb Stark heard before the killing began in earnest. The General Randyll Tarly considered himself a man of honor, and as a man of honor of duty he wasn't sure of this plan. Battles, they should be fought in the field, not in ballrooms or halls. He disdained this Game of Thrones everyone insisted on playing, almost as much as he disdained the Iron Throne itself. Ugly thing, ghastly. They say the Mad King kept cutting himself on it, which in turn led to another of his nicknames, King Scab. How could a man bear to sit on such a wretched piece of metal? How could a man plot and scheme and win half the realm for themselves in less than a year? He knew his place and was content in it for the most part. House Tarly bred soldiers, not kings. Moreover, they did their duty. Lesser men would try to rise above their station, bringing havoc in their wake like those fool Tyrell women. It had all worked out for her family in the end. Yet what if it hadn't? If those grasping girls had played their hand poorly, or made a mistake, or been caught, the Reach might well be on fire right now. Gods, just thinking about it gave him a headache. Marjorie would be queen one day, that much was certain. Stannis would not live forever, and his son was much loved. That son had wed a rose, and he thought the matter closed. Then came the return of a bloodline he thought all but extinct. The exotic beauty returned thankfully without an army from her exile across the sea. The last Targaryen, the mother of dragons, she brought no army with her, but her children were the second coming of Aegon himself. Should they lay eggs? Should they hatch? Well, Westeros had endured dragons centuries before. Would they be able to do so again? Did they have any say in the matter? He supposed not. Hers were large, already near enough to ride. They were growing larger every day, free to roam as they pleased. 7 hells. Once the 3 of them were fully grown, once they were larger, no betrayal was not an option. Perhaps it had never been an option. They held most of the cards, and the rest would come to them soon enough. Who would stand against them? The North was with the Crown, the Reach was with the Crown, the bloody Riverlands and Dorne were with the Crown. What remained? The Westerlands. Tywin Lannister had snatched Dragonstone, sure enough, but Stannis was even now putting together a force to lay siege to Casterly Rock in retaliation. The Iron Islands, those reaving, raping raiders, what leader did they have? What could they do alone? What could he? He'd been charged with their protection, no less made to wait away from the twins, ready to sweep. And if that duplicitous weasel proved himself treacherous, at least there might be a battle at such a distance. It was all he could do, just to see the fires of the mixed camp any moment now, and it would begin. It galled him to realize there was nothing he could do about this. Never mind the plan, the idea of a Targaryen, or the children of one sitting the Iron Throne years from now. It galled him. Mace Tyrell the oaf had been loyal to them perhaps, but Randyll had secretly rejoiced to see them gone, and now they were back in the crown's good graces. How soon would it be before the prince had an accident? No, he liked it not, trusted it not. In his eyes they were all born despite their lineage, a bastard boy, a meddling schemer, and a girl with 3 dragons. Who would have thought he'd know the moment he laid eyes on the 3 of them? The bold stag, the grasping rose, and the mother of dragons herself. Those 3 would do more than rule. For better or worse, they would change the world. Only time would tell if he changed with it. Thankfully, in that moment the distant clatter of battered boots clambering up the hill claimed his attention, and Randall entertained no further thought on the matter. Silently he counted the moments until the scout arrived to make his report. Odd that he'd returned early, didn't have a horse when he'd sent him out. The vaguest notion of concern prickled at his scalp. A hand reached back to Heartsbane's hilt, fingers curling around it in restless anticipation. Come as he looked on, a harried-looking man was shepherded into the room. Poor sod, he looked like he'd seen better days and would not see them again. Both a helmet and the better part of his left ear were missing, but he'd returned regardless. Wounded? Surely he hadn't ridden down to the twins. He was meant to ride in the other direction. Report, he demanded briskly. Our riders, Lord, the man stuttered out, approaching the twins. An ambush? Then how many thousands, sir? What banners do they bear? Lannister, came the stuttering response. A small smile stole across Randall's grim face, like that of a shark. It seemed his wish for battle would be granted tonight. After all, he had suspected Tywin would take advantage of this opportunity. How could he not? He would be a fool to ignore this chance. There would never be a greater opportunity than this for the old lion, be it through poison or deceit or outright force of arms. He would strike. Tarly had suggested as much to the fool prince, and in a surprising show of character he had given him a score of men to bolster his forces in case of just such an attack. Would the old lion lead his men into battle? Did he care enough to fight him? It would be so easy to ignore them. For a moment Randall was tempted. He had but to stand aside, and the forces below would be crushed against the twins. The stag, the rose, and the dragon would fall to the lion's claws. While the hunter looked on, temptation gnawed at him anew, and he found himself standing on a precipice, unable to decide. Duty commanded that he act. Duty drove him. Stannis was his king, and his loyalty was to the crown, not some grasping lion looking to avenge the fallen honor of his pride. No, his duty was clear, no matter how much he might loathe it. Eventually Tarly shunted his darker emotions aside. Rally the men. Then he commanded spears and shields. Without another word he saddled his horse and drew Heartsbane from her sheath. One way or another someone would meet the stranger tonight. It only remained to be seen who would fall first. Time skip. The killing of men is a thankless task one none should celebrate. Naruto took no pleasure in this violence, not the blood on his blade, nor the cries of the injured and the dying, not the bodies underfoot, nor the wound in his back. 7 hells, the bloody thing itched when he swung his sword. A stray fry archer had gotten lucky. Never again he'd hacked the man's head off. For his supposedly lucky shot someone had applied a hasty poultice to it and wrapped the wound in clean bandages before he'd gone back out in the chaos. It was both best he could hope for and less than he needed. It would hold. It had to keep going. Lad Ulrich clapped him on the back, and the blonde fought down a hiss as his wound howled in protest. We're nearly there. Well, at least he'd stopped calling him prince in this chaos. They said a good leader should lead from the back, but he couldn't bear the thought of leaving his men in this chaos. He tried to ignore the bodies underfoot as he cleared the last few steps into Walder Frey's keep. His men fought with him every step of the way, forming a protective phalanx around him as they cut a bloody red swathe through the chaos. None dared speak further for fear of angering him. Gods above, that is, until Drogon surged by belching flame upon a group of fry archers in the tower above. Regal wasn't far behind, and with him came Viserion. Even from this distance it was impossible to ignore their screams. Some of the men made a sign with their fingers. Naruto fought down a curse blast. At all in hindsight he should have considered how he and his brothers might react to the bloodshed, but he simply hadn't considered it at the time. No, that wasn't it. He'd made assumptions. Assumed that Daenerys would be able to keep her children under control. She hadn't, or rather couldn't, and everything had gone to pot because of it. Naruto grit his teeth and advanced. Every soul would say that the Freys had attacked first. Of course they had. Most of them were mad with a rage not of their own making. As far as poisons went, basilisk blood lived up to its name. 2 men broke through to rush him, and he spun to meet them in a whirling dervish of steel. A clumsy swing was easily batted aside. Then he yanked, shunted the larger one's shield out of the way, and carved a trench into his chest. He slumped with a bloody gurgle. His fellow stumbled back, alarmed by the sight, and Naruto showed no mercy. He cut through his face and bounded towards a third, even now surging Around the corner, no doubt responding to the noise, dark eyes widened in shock and fear as the Fry fumbled with his sword. Too late, wait, no, stop, you can't. Even as the poor sod babbled at him, he surged forward and used his weight to slam the Fry against a wall. Grasping fingers flailed at his face, trying to gouge at him, to no avail. In a single swift movement he plucked a dagger from his belt and rammed it through his victim's throat. The blade bit deep, and those flailing hands flew away vainly, trying to staunch the bleeding. Still the son of the Stag advanced. As the man slid to the floor, he knew on a fundamental level that it was wrong to kill your fellow man, especially with treachery so black as this, but in the same vein it was a necessary evil. Sometimes you had to commit vile acts in the name of good. Conversely, sometimes cruel men feigned at being good before they struck their foes down. Which was he then, good, evil, something in between? The question plagued him as he waded through the madness. These survivors, because they had to leave, some would sing songs about this, and not the sort he liked. They would call it the Red Wedding after this, or perhaps the Black Wedding for this foulest of treachery. Could it be called such when old Walder planned to strike first? Was he doing the right thing? He had his answer when Daenerys of all people met him at the main doors, bright eyes sharp and shoulders stiff. She had her guards with her, of course, yet her expression was anything but triumphant. Words sprang to his lips, but before he could voice them, the cloying scent of smoke and burned flesh reached his nose. Worse, they seemed to be guarding the doors themselves, preventing anyone from opening them. Naruto's stomach plummeted as he saw the ruined roof in the chamber above, and once again the ghastly stench of burnt flesh pervaded his nostrils. No, he'd meant to take Walder prisoner and have him confess. Not this. No man could survive dragon fire, certainly not a Fry. If the flames hadn't gotten him, the smoke would have opened the doors. He forced the words out through gritted teeth. No one moved. I said, let me through, damn it, I need to see you. Shouldn't she? Laid a hand on his arm, stopping him cold. Her words held him, riveted him. He's dead, and is everyone in there with him? To a man, a frustrated snarl built in the back of Naruto's throat, and he stubbornly choked it down. There would be no hope of occupying the twins now, not after this disaster. What damage the dragons hadn't done might yet be repaired or even rebuilt, but no one would want to be anywhere near the crossing, not after this disaster. Fear would accomplish what blade and fire could not. Half the realm would balk at this, the rest would be terrified by the madness this conveyed. Just the thought of it had him gritting his teeth. It didn't matter if they installed a puppet here, people would talk. Even in death the enemy somehow managed to spite him, and so passed the late Lord Walder Fry with not a soul to hear. Time skip. Naruto rather liked the cold, but really there could be too much of a good thing. Perhaps he was a bit biased in that regard. Having experienced the blistering heat of Dorne and King's Landing firsthand, he found that he actually preferred cooler climates by far. After all, one could only take off so many layers before you were down to your britches, and little else in the chill of the night one could simply bundle up with as they could find. Hailing from the Stormlands might have made him more predisposed to winter than most, but after several days of hard riding he wasn't much a fan of it. And make no mistake, winter was coming. Although he knew the north well enough from his boyhood days to navigate the terrain, and Robb certainly seemed to know his way about. The same could not be said for the soldiers they'd brought. Even now the larger part of their forces were faltering, weary from such a long journey. Part of him almost pitied them, the rest wanted them to stop dragging their feet and reach the bloody wall. Already atop his saddle the miles bled together, blurring by in a river of brown and white as he rode ever onward. The crisp chill stung in his cheeks, breath a plume of warmth in the frosty air. Even now the cold tried to creep in under his fur cloak and jerkin, seeping into the light metal of his armor like death's caress. For all that the road was surprisingly well kept for him and his entourage alike. Soon enough the flat snowy ground became rolling hills, and those in turn gave way to a steady ascent, one that led them ever upward, higher and higher towards the creeping chill of the true north. His vision had led him here to what he knew, not only that they must be here, that and they weren't going to make it to the wall before nightfall. For all the grumbling of the men and the tireless pace he'd set, it just wasn't possible. He forced them to press on a ways more still until the last of the light finally threatened to slip away altogether. Even then he could see it looming in the distance, a great barrier of ice and magic that safeguarded the world, but not forever. Nothing lasted forever. The wall might endure for years yet, or not. He had no way of knowing, no way to quiet the silent dread in the pit of his stomach. Why did he have a bad feeling about this? Someone touched his arm, snapping him back to reality. He looked back and found Marjorie's soulful eyes gazing into his own. She'd taken to the cold quite well. She looked downright regal in her fur trimmed coat, Her pale cheeks a deep and rosy red. They can't go any further today, beloved. Her voice was a dulcet caress against his ears. Let them rest. For a wild moment he actually considered forging on anyway. They were so close. An aggravated whinny caught his ear just in time. He heard the heavy beat of wings soon thereafter, causing the horses to panic. Viserion swooped down from the heavens and alighted clumsily on broken ground only a scarce few yards out, nearly bowling several men over with the downdraft from his wings. The mighty beast trilled once, and he soon saw the reason for his awkward landing. A dead deer lay caught in its claws. Regal dove in with one of his own, and together the two brothers feasts. Beloved, Naruto blinked his own dark thoughts away when Marjorie spoke up again. No, I'm fine, he muttered, palming his face. Just thinking and freezing my balls right off. His gaze swept back to the dragons, noting Drogon's absence. Danny was probably off riding him. The creatures seemed to be faring better now that they'd gotten away from the twins. Gods above, they really were getting big these days, already large enough to ride, and he'd be an absolute monster at this rate. That wasn't even taking his brothers into account. Now if only they could prevent them from flying out of control again. Marjorie must have seen the shadow pass across his face, because she reached out and tugged him closer. It wasn't your fault. It was kind of Marjorie to say that, perhaps even too kind. Naruto knew the words were meant to comfort him, to make him feel better, fill the gaping pit of grief and guilt that filled his soul. They were intended to heal, not hurt. He knew that. He understood that. Really he did. Even now, with the Riverlands long behind them, he could still smell them. The scent of burning flesh seemed to chase him like a shadow, a dread specter haunting his very soul. Isn't it? The words tore out of him with a growl. It is not. She matched her mount with his, keeping him from riding off. You did not plan what happened back at the twins. It was not your intent to kill that many, thus it is not your fault. He rounded on her with wild eyes as she stopped well short at his snarl, but didn't flinch even in the face of his fury. I planned for Walder Frey and his treachery. I planned for Tywin's ambush. How did I not plan for 3 hungry dragons that were on our side? She quirked a brow. Do you feel better now? As a matter of fact, yes, actually. Naruto blinked, realizing he'd spent what little wrath he had left. I'm sorry. He took a deep breath to steady himself, blinked once, and sighed. I didn't mean to lash out at you like that. I was just venting. I know. The Rose gave his arm a pat as they dismounted. Quite all right. You've had an awful lot on your mind as of late. He wanted to believe those words, that she meant them. Unfortunately, she'd proven herself damnably difficult. This was what made her dangerous. Marjorie was good and playing the doting wife when it suited her, the loving spouse to all who watched, but beneath that lay a cutting wit. It made her oh so difficult to read at times. She drew him in and kissed him sweetly, drawing bemused laughter from their men. The laughter died as Drogon swept down, landing heavily upon the ground. Blasted all. Daenerys all but slid off his back. It's too damn cold up here. Daenerys had only begun riding him recently during their journey north. The great black beast and his brothers seemed a little larger every day. Unfortunately, even the dragons seemed small before the towering fury now burning in her bright eyes. She took one look at Marjorie, her hands on his face, her close proximity to him, and all but stalked over. Sank your claws into him again, have you? Marjorie preened. I haven't the foggiest idea what you mean. Naruto pinched the bridge of his nose. Can the mother of dragons not ride a horse? Marjorie sniped. I was under the impression you feared neither man nor beast nor cold. Daenerys scowled. Their brief bout of peace hadn't lasted long. They had been like this ever since they'd gone south. He supposed this was a long time in coming, but did they have to do it here now with the soldiers watching? Really, I don't see what you contribute at all, Marjorie was saying as he came back to himself. I have the wealth and might of Highgarden behind me. What do you contribute to the cause? I have 3 dragons, and someday we'll have more. Drogon bared his teeth at her. Marjorie tried to rally. Maybe someday, but not today. Enough. Naruto's voice was like black ice, cold and deadly. Marjorie, see to the men. She swept off with a huff. Naruto watched her go with a sigh. What he wouldn't give for a drink about now. Daenerys slipped into his tent later that night. Naruto felt the cold beneath his furs long before her body tucked in against his. He sucked in a sharp breath through his teeth. You're freezing. I am. She reached for his trousers, pulled them down, and climbed atop him. Help me warm up, won't you? Her body was soft and inviting. Read for him in every way. She kissed him fiercely, all but crushing herself against him. Time skip. You're doing your best. Does it get easier? She patted his chest. I wish I could say it did. When they first met she wouldn't have made the effort that she did, so now spoke well. Both of her any feelings for him. Daenerys was so much easier to read. That Marjorie, if she was cross with someone, she did not hide it. If she was upset, she made no secret of her displeasure. That alone soothed his spirit. He leaned back. The people are terrified. Good. She Lifted her chin. Let them be. Let them fret and fumble. Why should we care what they have to say? Dany, his second wife, huffed. The phrase had surrendered, of course. That was never in doubt. With their treachery revealed, their army decimated, and their people laid to waste. It would be a miracle if they managed to hold on to the twins. They would never lay claim to the Riverlands now. Someone would likely root them out of there in the coming days. He wouldn't be surprised if Tully were the one to do it. Say what you would about the Blackfish, but he was a right thorough bastard. Despite his best efforts, Naruto found his thoughts flitting back to the massacre. He could still see it in his mind's eye. The bodies, the blood, the burns, not just the men but the women and the children too. It was an overwhelming victory for the crown, and her dragons had made it so, but at great cost. Daenerys wasn't to blame for this. If anything, he should have expected it. So much bloodshed in such a confined space was bound to drive any animal mad, even a dragon. This couldn't happen again. Someone would have to mind her children at all times, for they could not be locked away. Speaking of away, where's Marjorie? Daenerys frowned, not much liking the subject. She's with the men, seeing to their needs, fostering goodwill. More like Naruto heaved a sigh. She's sneaky like that, she huffed. Don't be taken in by her. The rose has thorns, and you have teeth. Her lips curled downward. Are you saying I cannot be diplomatic, dear husband? No, no. No, Naruto waved a hand. Not at all. Truly, he did enjoy her wit. Perished the thought. On a whim he reached out and cupped her cheek. Daenerys leaned into his palm with a sigh, reached up and curled her fingers around his. We shall get through this, she said. Together he wanted to believe. What do you think the watchers on the wall will say when they see us? That drew a smile from Daenerys. She traced a finger across his scarred chest. I imagine they'll be quite surprised. Time skip. Drogon was starving. It wasn't his fault. This place was cold with little food to be had. It made his scales itch. He knew his brothers felt the same way. There was prey here to be sure, but prey between three dragons was scarce prey indeed. The game had gone thin in passing days, and he was so very hungry, for the north was cold indeed, and the wall loomed ahead. Drogon liked it not too big, too much ice, not edible, in short, not food. He'd much rather be back in the south, safe and warm. In King's Landing there was fish and prey. There are plenty, even if Mother didn't like it when he ate the noisy meat bags. He didn't mind Mother's mate, he was alright, and the chosen of Viserion. Drogon accepted him, as did Regal, the one who smelled of flowers slightly less so, for no one could ever be better than Mother, but he could tolerate her. She gave good chin scratches and didn't balk much despite how big they grew. But back to the hunger, it gnawed at him, his stomach ached so. When some noisy meatbags started shouting, he took notice. Even here high in the sky he couldn't ignore the shrill shouting in the distance. The wall, so many men running about like little ants. He swept past them, heedless of their shrieks, skimming the wall. 7 beats of his great wings brought him to the top. His brothers weren't far behind. The air was thinner here, colder. His stomach growled anew. Had Drogon possessed the capacity for it, he would have grimaced. There were even less men atop the wall, many of whom even fell to their knees at the sight of them. Hopelessness and awe flashed across their face as he winged by this pleased Drogon. He was strong, he was mighty, he was powerful. The fleshy meatbags were right to fear him, but not all gave the respect they were due. One drew Drogon's eye from below. A bald fat man barking orders at men in the yard, hollering everyone but himself, hardly armored at all and utterly unaware of the approaching army. Loud, noisy, he would not be missed or mourned. Surely Mother wouldn't mind if he took a nibble, just a taste. Really fuel for the furnace at all. That Drogon swooping was good, yes, very good indeed. Jon had never seen a dragon before. He'd heard tell of them, of course, who hadn't, but to actually see one up close, much less 3 of them, it took a man's breath away. He hadn't thought to see them in his lifetime, or ever really. The sight of them stunned them into silence. Even Sir Alliser was stricken by the sight of these massive, majestic beasts. All of Castle Black was up in arms to see them, less so. Janos Slynt the oaf was still shouting orders when one of the beasts, the black one, swooped down and caught him in its talons. In a moment he was swept away, shrieking into the air, high above. A vicious tug of war ensured between the trio of dragons. Slynt did not survive it. Blood and viscera rained down upon them all. Perhaps were Jon Snow been a more vindictive man, Jon might have smiled, as it were. He permitted himself a grim moment of satisfaction. Little more then came the horror as he realized what such a beast might well do to the rest of them if they didn't think up something quickly. Oi, a man's voice barked from beyond the gate. Viserion, drop him. Jon rounded on the noise just in time to see someone vault over said gate, a young man with fiery hair and piercing blue eyes. How in blazes had he said? Man whistled sharply. I said drop him. One of the smaller beasts, and small was a relative term for creatures so large, landed atop Castle Black's wall. Its chosen perch groaned ominously. beneath its weight, but held for now. John noted its red jaws, and was that oh dear, it certainly was seen. This one had gotten a rather hefty chunk of slint. Indeed, that's right. The blue-eyed man stalked forward, shaking a rigid finger at the beast as though the digit were some mighty spear. I'm talking to you. Viserion looked away like a chagrined dog, still clutching of Slint's mangled lower torso between its mighty jaws. Don't give me that. You drop him right now, mister. Your mother's going to be so angry with you, Viserion growled. He's already dead. Belatedly, John noticed the crown upon his head. This must be the prince then. Fine, stop playing with your food. The dragon made a pleased noise and scarfed down the last of Slint. John winced at the audible crunch that followed. Even here at the wall they'd heard tell of what happened, of the new power in King's Landing. Stannis had sacked the city and taken it for his own. Beyond that, reports were sketchy at best. Castle Black seldom concerned itself with the outside world, save where it was necessary. If they'd known he had dragons. John World, startled from his reverie, grunted now as Arya of all people slammed into his chest 6 words. Sum things up quite nicely. What the devil did I miss? Time skip. Sir Alliser Thorne found himself conflicted. He supported the Targaryens. That much was true. Always had, always would, always will. He'd stood with them during Robert Baratheon's ignominious rebellion, defended kings when the traitorous Lannisters sacked the city. Even when King Aerys was stabbed in the back by the accursed Kingslayer, Thorne was still down in the city fighting. It had taken 10 men to lay him low and nearly a score more to drag him before Tywyn that day had seen him presented with a choice: die with his king or live in exile. So yes, he had fought for the Targaryens. He'd been sent to the wall fighting for them, and in a sense he was still fighting now. Only difference was this time Alliser's heart was fighting itself for good reason. At that, you see, Alliser Thorne was a proud man. He held that pride near and dear, for sometimes it was all that kept him going. But at the end of the day, Thorne was also a smart man. He'd heard the rumors down south, read the messages brought by the ravens. He knew the winds had shifted. Robert Baratheon was gone, and his foul spawn with him, his elder brother, had taken the throne, purging the Lannisters from King's Landing by force of arms and wit of treachery. Bloody Baratheons, all they did was take, and then the tides again turned, not once but twice, kicking up a strange vortex of miracles and coincidence that had just now landed on his doorstep. Many a man claimed the gods were cruel. If so, they were undoubtedly laughing at him now. A party unannounced, an arrival most unexpected, an infestation that had all but taken over Castle Black. Hot air rushed overhead, and despite his best efforts, Thorne flinched as a great black beast hurtled through the skies. A lilting cry followed as 2 smaller but no less deadly shapes jointed away. They wheeled into the sky, angels of terrible death winging into the cloudy day. Gods above, he'd never get used to that. Dragons had been extinct for years, yet here they were ascendant once more. This was his reality now, and he wasn't sure he could accept it. Someone laughed from above, a sharp rich sound that had him looking up. Once more Land Drogon, the largest of the beasts, wheeled down gracefully, narrowly missing the gatehouse so close he could nearly touch it, lashing the castle with a windstorm born from his wings. Thorne didn't fail to notice the stag clutched in its jaws. Symbolism it most assuredly was not, but it wrung a small spiteful smile from him all the same. Perhaps it was petty of him. No, it undoubtedly was, but tiny things like that kept him going these days. That blasted Baratheon boy might come to Castle Black with his retinue in tow alongside 3 sodding dragons, but in doing he'd brought her with him. He didn't loathe the lad as much as he did Ned Stark's bastard, but it was close, too close for his liking. In a perfect world he would gladly be right of them all and be done with it. Not so the Targaryen girl. He looked upon her now. Daenerys Targaryen, last living kin of Aerys Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Here in the flesh she slid off the dragon's back like she'd been born to it, dismounting with an easy grace that bespoke of 3 days practice spent here at the wall. She didn't even pay them any mind, focused as she was on her dragon, idly stroking its long neck. Look at her, one of the watchmen muttered beside him. Blasted wench, wouldn't be nothing without those overgrown lizards. Thorne's temper sparked. He reined it in with a grinding growl. Watch your tongue. His sworn brother didn't catch the warning. What's to watch? She's probably mad just like her father. Alliser whirled and cuffed the man across the mouth. He dropped like a sack of rocks and dashed his head against the floor. Thorne stepped over his dazed body, left him there to sleep in the cold, and stomped away. Let one of the others find him and drag him back to bed. He'd be nursing a broken jaw come morning. That was a fine right hook. Thanks for defending her honor. He paused, gloved hands clenched into fists at his sides. I didn't do it for you. I know you didn't. Soft footsteps echoed behind him, circled him, and sure enough he found himself faced with the Baratheon brat in question. The lad looked healthy enough. He'd been complaining of headaches these last 3 days, but now they seem to have abated. Cheeky prince was even smiling at him. May I have a word? Thorne's temper flared. He stomped it down to a simmer. Speak your piece and be done with it, Baratheon brat. I have a defense to prepare. Naruto smiled and took the insult in stride. The former King Joffrey would have shrieked and screamed for his head, but he wasn't Joffrey now, was he? On the contrary, there was a keen gleam in the boy's eye, one that took a strange stoic amusement in needling an otherwise tired and bitter old man. Thorne wasn't sure he liked it. I understand you fought for the Targaryens once. It wasn't a question, they both knew it to be true. During the reign of King Aerys. More mockery. How it galled him. I did. I fought and I lost. He swept a gloved hand to the snowy ruin of Castle Black. Now I'm here freezing my arse off at the end of the world. What of it? The boy planted both hands in his pockets, stepped to him, looked him square in the eye. And would you like a chance to fight again? Thorne's entire world turned to ice 10 times over. What do I have to spell if out for you? A flicker of annoyance passed through the young man's bright blue eyes. I'm offering to release you from your vows. You dolt. The crown has that power. Redemption. The thought burned through Thorne like wildfire. A chance to serve the Targaryens again, to atone for his mistakes. And yet I took a vow, and you will serve that vow, the prince retorted glibly, albeit in a different capacity. We need every sword we can find for the battles to come. Thorne tried to speak, his tongue failed him. I don't understand means welcome aboard. The prince clapped his back and kept walking. Daenerys will be happy to have another supporter. Do try to get on with Saber Baratheon, won't you? Thorne couldn't bring himself to follow. Would you rather stay here then? Naruto glanced over his shoulder where the dragons still danced in the sky like gods of old, or perhaps you prefer rather be dragon food like your friend here. At last that pulled a response from Thorne. Janoslen, a friend? Ha, he was no friend of mine. A low throaty chuckle filled the night. Didn't think so. Come along then, you're not the only one we're recruiting today. You work for me now. Locke narrowly caught the coin purse, fumbling fingers fiddled with the string and opened it. Bloody thing was full to bursting, so much so that the mere act of holding it nearly sent the coins spilling onto the chill ground below. 7 hells, there was more money in this bag than he'd seen in his entire life. Lord Bolton hadn't paid him half as much, and the dwarf merely smiled at him. It was not a pleasant smile. He had the same look about him as those dragons. And in that moment Locke knew if he spoke falsely, if he lied, if he tried to fool the little lion, he'd have his head on a spike before daybreak. It was not the gold that bought his allegiance, it was that look, that smile. Fuck killing Jon Snow or finding Bran Stark. He'd be lucky to get out of Castle Black in one piece with Mother of Dragons watching his very move. Why me? He croaked at last. A little bird told me you're good at what you do, came the ready answer. We both came from nothing. Neither of us are afraid to get our hands dirty, so you're going to help me find the Stark boys, but there will be no reaving, no raping, none of it. If you lay a hand on them, the hand comes off. Followed shortly thereafter by your head. Understand? Behind him Drogon roared, and the world shook high above them. The very wall itself seemed to tremble. Well, that simplified things, didn't it? He wasn't fucking with no dragon, not even for Roose. I am Lord the Hunter. Now your will be done. Naruto gazed at the dagger. It was good solid steel, not Valyrian like his other blade, but it had served him well since it first came into his possession. Solid, reliable, it had never once faltered in the face of adversity, though he at times had. Even now he glimpsed his stoic reflection in its cold edge, a stranger's face, weary and tired by the journey, and so much more. He turned it end over end in his hand, trying to find some imperfection with it. Upon failing to do so, he found himself all the more disappointed. Steel never faltered, flesh did. There were times when he wished his heart could be the same, that he could simply advance without want or feeling or concern for anyone else. But he couldn't be that man. He knew never was, never had been, never would be. His dreams had led him to this moment. He knew what he had to do in regard to the wildling army, and likewise what would follow. He simply didn't know if he had the strength to commit himself. A scarred hand palmed his face. Times like these he missed his old friend. Someone knocked on the door. He heaved a sigh. Come, he said softly. The door to his chambers creaked open. Naruto looked up, squinting against the fading light of the hearth. He had thought it might be Marjorie, but no, she found himself pleasantly surprised. Daenerys slipped inside, clad in a white fur robe, face gone pensive. He had time enough to glimpse Saber Baratheon behind her, granted him a brief nod. The old knight returned it and closed the door behind the princess. She paid it little heed and sat beside him. Her head came to rest upon his shoulder. She smelled of dragon, or rather Drogon. The scent was strangely comforting to him. How are you feeling? Better, he muttered. The headaches are gone. Him, she said, no more content to lean against him. It was too much. His tongue committed the foulest of mutiny. I've begun to remember, he said. Suddenly, apropos of nothing, she pulled back, bright eyes, quizzical face furrowed in a frown. What my life? He raised his gaze to look her in the eye, gauging her reaction, not just the dreams. As the closer we got to the wall, he turned the dagger end over end in his hand, balancing it on razor's edge, before a moment more before slamming in his sheath. But what came before the closer we came to, the easier it became. Maybe it has something to do with the magic here. A nervous chuckle burst out of him. Dark and rueful. Maybe I've always been able to remember, but just didn't want to. What are you saying? The truth. It was then he'd been silent enough these past few days. My name. He took a breath, steadied himself, and sighed. My real name is Naruto Uzumaki, not Baratheon. When she didn't interrupt, he barreled onward. I died in one world, and was born again here in another. I killed many who were deserving, and many who were not. He looked her square in the eye. I killed my best friend I'd forgotten all about. That buried the memories deep, but I can't anymore. Though you deserve to know, even if you think I'm mad. She touched his hand, threaded her fingers through his, and smiled softly. I believe you. His brain fizzled, blazed anew. Now was it really that easy? You'd do? What would you have me say? She nestled closer to him with a huff. I've seen and heard all manner of madness since I met you. All this talk of wildlings and dead things, even dragons themselves were extinct, until recently an amnesiac prince reborn in another world is hardly the strangest thing I've encountered since I crossed the narrow sea. Why didn't she understand? But I'm not who you thought I was, aren't you? She met his gaze evenly. Have your feelings toward me changed? No, that much was a certainty. He cared for her just as much as he did Marjorie. The only reason he'd broken this to her first was because he felt hope she might understand. Her life was more rooted in mysticism and magic than any other. Marjorie would be the one that needed convincing, and for the life of him he hadn't figured out a way to broach the subject with her yet. There you have it then. Daenerys tugged a strand of pale hair aside and kissed his cheek. You once said it yourself. Who we were is not who we are. We must be better. His smile grew. Wise words from the mother of dragons. Will wonders never cease? She must have known there was more to it, because her gaze didn't relent. These visions of yours, there's more, isn't there? He nodded glumly. A log cracked in the hearth. She pressed him. What else did you remember or see? His gaze turned back to the fire. Therein lie the rub. Knowledge was like madness. Too much could break a person, but he couldn't lie. Not to her. The past. He touched a hand to the hilt of his sheathed dagger. The present, the future, more vivid than ever before. He hoped she wouldn't ask hers. In the end he was disappointed, and what came of it? Best make the cut quick. Then you claimed the Iron Throne. Daenerys perked up. I did. Oh, Dany. Her ambition might be muted, but it was still there. She still wanted to be queen. When Stannis died, as if it were that simple. Yes, he said. She saw the haunted look in his eyes. What did it cost? Everything. His words slaughtered her smile, and it wounded him to do so. You lost your every friend, you every ally, all but one of your dragons, even your own sanity. By the end you went mad. Westeros was yours, but you were the scourge of it, a monster, just like your father. The mother of dragons flinched, but rallied, and then you died. He couldn't quite keep the bite from his voice. Stabbed a gloved hand, mimed the motion to his chest, right through your heart. You never saw it coming. Drogon took your corpse, melted the Iron Throne, and flew back across the narrow sea, never to be seen again. Daenerys recoiled. I died. No, 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 don't go this way. Listen. She slapped his hand away and sprang to her feet. I died. Listen. He caught her by the wrist, touched a hand to her cheek, and turned her face back to him, reeling her back to the bed. Listen to me now. She didn't fight him. It's like what you said to me, that Daenerys wasn't you, isn't you. She will never be you, just as you will never be her. She looked away. You sound so certain. Of course I am. I didn't exist in that timeline. He pivoted, fixing her with a heated look. And frankly, I'm glad I wasn't. The realm was a mess. Everyone wanted that damn throne so badly. It all went to shit because of that damn chair. I don't think I'd be able to do a damn thing to fix that timeline better than I'm in this world. Silence reigned between them, broken but for the crackling of the hearth. You say you saw a vision of a world that might be not. As she took a deep breath and turned to brace herself and turned steady, and then turned her body towards him once more. Is there any chance that the events you saw might still come to pass? Naruto blinked, paused, gave it some thought. Now would it? For one, the Starks were a fair sight better this time around than they had been. By contrast, the Lannisters were in decline. Cersei and Jaime imprisoned were, while Tyrion was firmly on the crown's side. Tywin didn't dare approach King's Landing for fear of what befall his last living heir, and it would take him decades to raise a new one, assuming he could even sire a child at his age. Daenerys was in Westeros early with a strong power base, and while things were strained between her and Marjorie, they hadn't come to blows. Marjorie would never die in a blaze of wildfire, not with the caches beneath the sept. of Baelor cleared away. The men favored her here too. Anyone could see that she was even now promising pardons to men of the Night's Watch, rather those who would prove themselves worthy of such an honor that was bound to cause ripples. Not all of them good hells, there might not even be a watch after all was said and done. Many a man here was a murderer or rapist, and worse, cowards and cravens who had chosen to take the black rather than face the headsman's axe. But for every monster here there was also a man, innocent souls who had been sentenced for poaching or committed dark deeds for the sake of their families. These were the ones they wanted, but tensions yet remained too, in particular about you and Marjorie. Daenerys tensed, her face hardening into granite. I know not what you speak of, don't deny it, he sighed. Whatever is going on between the two of you needs to stop. The mother of dragons Huff tossed her head a little and lifted her chin to glare at him. She's the one to instigate, Dany. I don't have time for it. We don't have time for it. He grasped her hand, not to hold her this time, but to comfort her. I already swore your children will be treated equally. His fingers threaded with hers, holding tight. No one will be disinherited, supplanted, none of that. Now it was her turn to sigh. I am well aware of your words. He frowned a little. Then why snap at one another? Are you truly so blind to it? She rounded on him in turn. She mocks me, slights me when you aren't looking, and you favor her. You were meant to be with her. If not for Littlefinger's machinations, I know they never would have met, or if they had, it would have been as enemies. He shook that disquieting thought off. But as I said, my feelings haven't changed right now. We need to figure out what the blazes is going on up here, deal with the wildling army, then get back to the capital with all due haste. I don't like the idea of leaving Sta father, he corrected himself ruthlessly, alone with that red woman for this long. Daenerys laid a hand on his, perhaps sensing his disquiet. I thought we were going to venture further out beyond the wall. We were. He shivered a little at the memory of his vision, but not that far. What we have here is a small force to deal with that thing. We need an army. Armies, he corrected. It shouldn't be too hard to convince them, provided we bring back proof. We have dragons, surely we can. You lose one of your dragons here, Dany. He hadn't wanted to tell her that, but needs must, he supposed. Ah, she froze. Another of your visions again? He granted her a glum nod. At length she found her voice again. Which one, Viserion? Her breath hitched. I'm sorry, don't be. I won't let him die. As to the future coming to pass, it shouldn't, he said it haltingly, choosing his words with great care, but my knowledge only extends so far. Things have changed. We still have enemies, and I'm not sure how to deal with all of them. Then we will remind them of their place. How the ghost of a smile touched his whiskered face. You and Karama would have gotten on famously. He regretted the words the moment he said them, if only because she tilted her head a little. Who or what is a Karama? Someone he missed, someone he'd never ever see again. Would that he'd come with him? A story for another time. It's late, and there's still much to do. Wait. She caught his hand when he made to stand. Dany, she wanted to say something else. He could see it in her eyes, burning with repressed passion, not just lust or love, but fear. He wondered what it might be. Remember. Instead she laid a hand on his. I am yours, and you are mine, the blood of my blood. She rolled her shoulders, and her robe dropped to the floor, bearing herself to him. Come, let us speak no more of the past and prophecy tonight. The ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. As my lady commands. Her lips crushed against his as his fingers tangled in her long hair, lost in passion as they were. Neither saw the door close, sealed from without. None noticed the all too keen gaze watching them both. Soft footsteps carried the eavesdropper away. Naruto had her out and about again. Only 8 hours later the sudden turn of pace baffled Daenerys. She couldn't fathom why he'd woken her before dawn in such a manner. Moreover, she was tired and sore and not at all in the mood, but at his gentle urging she dressed herself once more, and off they went, prowling through the quiet corridors of Castle Black with naught but Cerberus tan for company. She liked it not, but trusted there was purpose in it. Why depart so early in the morning, and with just the three of them? It smacked of some secret plot. Perhaps sensing her confusion, Naruto nudged her with an elbow. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Now's the best time. Daenerys glared daggers at him. What possible use could I have for any of these miscreants? Well, one or two might surprise you. Speaking of which, in short order she found herself guided through the darkened halls. He certainly seemed to know where he was going, which suggested he'd been this way before. Did it have something to do with his visions, or had he simply been thorough? She suspected it was the latter. Naruto could be devilishly thorough when he wanted to be. In no time at all they reached a worn yet sturdy door, one which the prince opened and ushered her through into the room beyond. She entered without fear. An aging man sat at a table within, face-limbed in dull candlelight. Maester, by the look of him, he had a great many chains draped round his dark robes by the milk white of his He was quite blind, and yet his head turned toward them all, the same sharp ears on this one. A faint smile touched at the corner of his mouth, and though he could not see, she sensed a keen wit in his aging eyes. Who comes? His voice wasn't frail at all, weary perhaps, but not weak. Friends, good Maester. Naruto smiled and urged Daenerys onward. My lady wife here would like a moment of your time. Daenerys whipped around to glare at him. I would, trust me, he winked. You won't regret this. She sat with a scowl. I had best not. The blind Maester frowned. This is most irregular. My prince will leave the two of you alone. Naruto spoke over embarrassed Tan, and I will be right outside. Yes, shoo. Daenerys swatted at him. Blasted all. Why was she feeling so cranky? Surely it was too soon for that. I'll be fine. Leave me to whatever nonsense this is. Naruto didn't retort, but departed with a knowing smile, shutting the door in his wake. At length the Maester sighed softly. Well then, I suppose we had best make ourselves comfortable. The prince cares for you a great deal, it seems. Daenerys knew bait when she saw it. She also knew better than to rise to such a trap. Allow me to repeat something I once told a young man who, like you, found himself at a crossroads. The blind Maester offered a small grim chuckle. Love is the death of duty. I said that to him once. He didn't listen. Duty is difficult after all. He chortled softly. What is honor compared to the one you love? What is duty to the feel of a newborn son in your arms? Daenerys felt a strange sensation kick at her chest. She ignored it. Had Naruto foreseen this too? No, impossible. Surely his foresight didn't extend so far. The nameless Maester spoke again. You love that boy, don't you? If looks could kill, this blind Maester would be a pile of smoldering ashes on the floor. I am fond of him. It is not love. Heat hit Dany's face even as she said the words, a lie emerging out of sheer reflex. I am fond of him. He is pleasant company. No more. I say again, I do not love him. Yes you do. A knowing lilt entered his voice. You'd give your life for him in a heartbeat. She would. I most certainly would not. Yes you would. He smiled, sightless eyes reflecting an almost parental mirth. Heard it in your voice just now. I remember how it sounds. I was in love once. If you can imagine all manner of horrors befalling that poor boy, is it so difficult to imagine that an old man once was more or less like you? He patted the table once, fingers tracing the worn stump of a candle. After all, nothing makes the past a sweeter place to visit than the prospect of imminent death. She stilled. If you mean to threaten me, you will find I am not so helpless. Child, he tooted, it is not you I speak of. I know the sound of a doomed man when I hear it, and to think you carry his child. Panic, terror, anger, all these and more bleated through her chest in an instant, setting her heart to racing. He knew. How did he know? She wanted to tell Naruto last night. Truly she did, but she'd only just discovered it herself, and even now the thought of it terrified her. To lose another child as she had her first. How did you? I may be blind, girl, but I am a Maester. A finger wagged her away. Your footsteps are heavy with more than mere purpose, and you are quick to temper. A pause now when she didn't deny it. He doesn't know, does he? Ah, he suspects perhaps, but to know you know nothing. She sprang to her feet with a hiss. No one does. I am alone in this realm, the last of my line, and you. She scowled at him, squinted now, noting his strangely pale hair. Who are you? Do you wish to know? Silence reigned in the library. Daenerys lifted her chin. I would have it said my father was Mikard. He spoke slowly, a note of sardonic amusement creeping into his voice. First of his name, my brother Aegon reigned after him when I had refused the throne. Her blood burst into fire at his words, and her lips parted in confusion, but words refused to come as the Maester prattled on. He was followed by his son Aerys, whom they called the Mad King. Daenerys shot out of her chair. Again, you're him, Aemon Targaryen. I am indeed, came the dry answering croak. And who are you? You sound rather. Her hands gently closed around his wrinkled fingers as she knelt before him. My name is Daenerys. Daenerys Targaryen. Oh, he wheezed out a startled laugh. Oh my. His hands quivered a little, reaching up to touch her face to better feel her. I had heard, but to think you would be here, and so we meet at last. How unexpected. And all this time you were alone here. At the last his voice broke. Under siege, no proper family to guide or protect you. Your last relation thousands of miles away, useless, and dying a Targaryen alone in the world truly is a terrible thing, isn't it? She squeezed his hand. But we are not alone now. Great Uncle Aemon Targaryen sighed, a soft raspy sound like unfurling old parchment. No, I suppose we are not, dear girl. The old Maester would weep long and hard on that cold bitter morning. Yes, he wept for quite some time indeed, in the arms of a long-lost princess. Time-skip dragons. John, can you believe it? Actual dragons. I see them. Sam hard not to gorgeous beasts. He could see the three of them feasting out there from the gate, gorging themselves on cows brought up just shy of castle. Black, magnificent creatures, unlike any other. They looked large enough at this distance he couldn't even begin to imagine what they were like. When one drew closer, he felt a faint tug in his chest at the sight, a strange feeling, he couldn't quite explain it. And they're closer to them, two figures, one in dark furs, The other wearing white, the prince and princess. He wanted to be out there with them, with the dragons. He wasn't quite sure why. It almost felt as if he were being called along, and really he'd spoken to them briefly only the other day. "I'm just a bastard, your grace." Those keen violet eyes had regarded Jon for a long moment. "Unsettling, no," Daenerys had said at last, shaking her head in quiet denial. "I don't think you are." The prince had smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll figure it out sooner or later. When you do, we'll be waiting." Even now those words gnawed at him. What did that mean? What did they know? He was a Snow, nothing more, nothing less. His father was a Stark, Ned Stark. He couldn't be anything more than that, could he? Sam nudged him with an elbow. "Jon, fine, Sam." He turned an ashen glower on him. His fat friend disagreed. "You don't look fine, you're paler than ghost." Jon shook his head, stuffed the urge down deep inside him and locking it in a box, alongside his feelings for Ygritte. Ygritte, his heart hurt just thinking of that fiery, feisty girl. She was out there somewhere, he knew, watching, waiting, preparing, making more arrows. She was probably looking to put in him arrows he rightly deserved for breaking her heart. There would be a battle soon, had to be. Mance was close, he would strike any day now. Tormund would as well. They'd hit them from both sides, and when they attacked, the world would change again. A bitter smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. His worldview had been upended not once but thrice since he'd come to the wall. Now it threatened to change yet again. These were terrible times they lived in, strange, terrible times. Father was gone, Joffrey dead, good bloody riddance. King's Landing sacked, the Lannisters ousted from power, Stannis ruled in their places. Line ascendant, Winterfell had been burned to the ground by Theon's treachery, only to be restored some months later. It was all happening so fast now. Even Robb and Arya were here, and the latter had scarcely left his side since, well, except now she was down there in the yard trying to convince Robb to let her pass the gate and see the dragons. Bloody, fearless girl. Sometimes he still wondered how they'd survived. Lady Stark and Sansa were safe and secure in winter, and if word was to believe, hunters were being sent out for Bran and Rickon, who just might be alive. His family was nearly restored, and now the king's men had come to the wall with dragons in tow. 3 bloody dragons. An angry squawk from down below told him Robb had failed to convince Arya. She wasn't about to stay put for this. The girl could outshout Sarah Alliser Thorne when she wanted to. Come to think of it, had barely said so much as 2 words to him for the last day. Now no, the ranger almost seemed to be avoiding him. One of the larger dragons belched fire in the distance. A hushed whisper went up from the watchers. Sam shuddered. "Never thought I'd ever see that." The nagging call tugged at Jon once more. "Care to get closer?" What? Sam did a double take. "No thank you, they'll do me the way they did Janos Slyne." Poor Slyne, he should have suffered longer. Still, Sam was right to be excited. With these forces from King's Landing, they might stand a better chance. Wait, what were the dragons doing? His eyes widened. "Oh dear." Naruto exhaled in a long-suffering sigh. "This is a bad idea, is it now?" Daenerys smiled at him, not a real smile, more a smirk, really little more than a lifting of the lips. He loved it when she smiled like that. "I happen to think it's an excellent one," he tooted softly. "You would." Castle Black loomed behind them, little more than a memory at this distance. It was necessary. Trying something like this too close to the wall promised disaster. "You said wanted to scout Mance Rayder's army." She walked past him, approaching Drogon with a sway in her step. "I can think of no better way than this." His brow shot into his hair. "On Dragonback, each and every Targaryen has it in them to ride a dragon." She traced a hand across Drogon's long neck. "You're no different. I'm no Targaryen." He rolled his eyes at her. "I don't know how to ride a bloody dragon." "Nobody does until they ride a dragon, stubborn girl." "I can't." "You can." She rounded on him, cupping his face in her hands with startling speed. "You are." Softly now she spoke, almost crooning to him. "However diluted your blood, maybe it still sings true. A dragon chooses you, not the other way around." Viserions clearly made his choice as he Viserion nosed him with a questioning trill. His heart leaped into his throat as he idly scratched the underside of the Wyrm's massive chin. He'd never ridden a dragon, not even in his first life. He'd seen visions of folk riding them, to be sure, but reality was a different beast. This didn't line up with any of the visions he'd seen. He hoped that was a good sign, a sign that things had changed, that he'd managed to avert that disastrous future he'd glimpsed in his dreams. And yet a part of himself, a very large part, preened at the idea of flying, the potential of falling to his death from such a great haste. Slightly less so, but he couldn't deny his excitement all the same. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Viserion certainly seemed keen enough. Rhaegal was watching Castle Black intently, likely because he knew Jon was there, and wasn't that another can of worms? While Drogon looked amused. How could a dragon be amused? Daenerys certainly looked at hey, he glowered her way. "You've only ridden Drogon a handful of times, don't be Smug she grinned. No more than you certainly. Regal trilled softly. It almost sounded like laughter. Cheeky. He looked back to Castle Black with a frown. Jon should be out here with us. Dany followed his gaze. Perhaps, but that is his choice to make. You cannot make it for him. His brow furrowed. Fair. He'd told Daenerys a great many things from his visions. She didn't feel threatened by Jon Aegon in this timeline. If anything, she pitied him. He would never inherit his true birthright. Stannis wouldn't have it, but he might yet ride a dragon one day if he could but find the nerve to ask. He needed to be more curious, like that Stark girl. Enough about him. His wife egged him on. Viserion likes you. You'll not have a better chance than this unless you're afraid. Oh, now she was aiming for his pride. He knew she was. They both did, but he couldn't help himself. Naruto heaved a sigh. He knew Marjorie wouldn't like this. What if he doesn't want me to? She grinned. Then I've enjoyed your company, husband. Taking a deep breath, he edged closer to Viserion. The green dragon capitulated at once, lowered his neck, and allowed him to find a foothold between his rich emerald scales. From there he hauled clawed really his way onto his back. His face burned with every second he wasted. Skill didn't mean a damn thing when he didn't know what you were doing. He didn't miss the soft giggle that followed. Where do I hold on to? Daenerys shrugged. Wherever you can. Panic set in. He hunched low and latched on tight to the dragon's neck. Spines for dear life. Viserion reacted instantly. He felt the dragon coil beneath him, body tensing, legs clenching before whomp. A thunderclap rattled the air as Viserion took flight, and all the world fell away beneath him. Behind him he heard an answering shockwave as Drogon followed suit, and Regal after him. He didn't dare look back at either of them. It was all he could do just to hold on. It felt like the world itself was trying to tear him apart, so he hunkered down and held on. Soon enough the fear faded. Wind blasted his hair back and stole his laughter away. This felt he couldn't find the right words for it anymore, so he didn't even try. Small wonder Daenerys loved to fly. This was true freedom. No politics up here, no grand Game of Thrones, just simple peace. Up and up they went until the wall suddenly didn't seem quite so large below them anymore, and there beyond it he saw the north, the real north. While he sucked in a breath that chilled his very lungs and hooped to high heavens, Daenerys wheeled Drogon ahead of them, cutting him off. He listened to his instincts and tugged Viserion after her. Aha, there he spied movement below, just past the tree. Showtime. Mance Rayder was a god-fearing man, none of that seven-pointed star shite. Oh no, he believed in the old gods and the magic and wonders that had come before. He'd seen dead men walk, and the things that drove them, the things that would making walking corpses of them all. Given half a chance. Someone once said the night was dark and full of terrors. They were right about that much. He'd seen all manner of monsters and madness north of the wall. Terrors to make a man quail. Right and proper terrors they needed to get away from, or they'd all be shambling corpses come winter. And right now he was listening to a new one. It began with a strange sound, a distant whomp that started softly, but soon enough it was all he could hear. He couldn't comprehend it, not at first. He rose from his campfire and squinted toward the horizon. There were dark specks in the sky approaching from the direction of the wall. What were those? Ravens? No, they were too big, much too big. What in the seven hells? Then came the winged shadow. It fell over the encampment. No, several shadows. 1, 2, no, 3. Now he looked up and froze. Gods be good. He knew of dragons who didn't, but to see them, 3 of the bloody things, black and green and gold, and so very bold, they wheeled past high overhead, heedless of the terror their presence inspired. An intrepid giant loosed an arrow at the biggest one. The shot went wide. Another bounced right off the black bugger's scaly hide. It kept right on flying, and then he glimpsed the rider on its back. The black one had a rider, the green one had a rider. Oh well, the gold one did not, and that worried him. Someone barked a word he didn't understand. Dracarys fire flashed forth from 3 mouths. Men and women screamed. Mance flung up an arm to shield his face, and yet he felt no pain. It took him a moment to realize why. Another to lower his arm and squint into the haze. The beasts had wheeled past and left them unharmed. Not so the earth. The trio of dragons had raked the ground with dragonfire, carving a smoldering trench in the frozen snow, a black line between them and the wall, a scorching symbol for all to see and fear. And he knew in that moment that they'd lost. The line had been drawn, the gauntlet thrown down. The challenge made. This changed everything. Everything crossing that line meant death. He knew that if the wall had bloody dragons, who knew what else they had, but they had to cross that line. They'd be worse than dead if they didn't. He might sing a song about this if he survived.